Okay, I think we have waited enough. Let's start. Um, Let me share my screen. I hope my screen is visible. Um, so in this session, we'll be discussing how do we manage state, and more specifically, we'll be discussing async state or server-side state or whatever you want to call it. Um, and if since only few people are here, you guys, if you have any questions, you can ask them right away. There's no need to wait. Okay. So let's start with what actually state is, right? And state is basically a piece of data that is stored in a variables or anywhere that you want React to re-render the UI whenever this data changes, right? So that's all it is. That's how it is different from simple variables that we create in JavaScript, is that React is keeping an eye on it, and when this data changes, React says, okay, I need to repaint the UI, I need to recalculate the DOM if anything has changed or not, um, and update the UI accordingly. So that's what state is. And there are like you can conceptually you can divide it into a client side state and server side state. Um, and mostly people don't do that, but that's how some of the people see the state. So, and client side state is basically is that a state that is owned by client. It's always up to date. And owned by client, I mean, is that it's in the browser, right? So when you load a page, there can be certain state, for example, users theme preferences or something like that, right? So that is in the browser, and it only the user that is operating that browser can change that. So it's like our state, only the user that is using the browser can change it, and it's usually ephemeral. It goes away when the browser is closed, right? So it's not persisted, for example, in a database. It just is, and then when you close the browser, it goes away, and when you open that web page again, it it loads again. And it is synchronous. That means it's instantly available. You don't have to make network requests, wait for it to be fetched, right? Usually it's just you click a button and the state changes, right? For example, this this toggle switch, right? So this is based on a state, right? And now the state of this toggle switch is expanded, and based on that we are showing the details or the content inside this toggle, right? But if I click on it, now this is not expanded, right? And this is like client side state. This is not stored anywhere in a database that if is this toggle open or not, right? If I close this Notion page and then reopen it, probably it won't be here. But the data itself, that is stored in a database, right? The data does not get deleted when I close the Notion page. Um, and it's always available to us when we open it again. And this is the other type of state. You can call it server state, you can call it async state. And this state is not ours in a way that it's not really in the browser all the time, right? And usually we have to get it from somewhere, and that somewhere is a server, and that is why you can call it server state. And then server actually gets it from the database, right? The server is not storing it on disk. So this type of state is persistent. It is stored in a database, which means that we have to, fetch it. We have to manage this whole life cycle of fetching the state. If there is an error, handle those errors, handle the loading states. So user gets feedback that data is fetching, and then sometimes we only want to fetch part of the data, like not all the data. For example, my Notion has a lot of pages, but probably they don't load all the pages whenever I open Notion, right? They open the detail of a pages. They probably load it when I open a specific page. So this state is server owned, right? And what we actually get uh, is just a snapshot of that state, right? Um, from the database. The actual source of truth is the database, and it can or cannot be owned by many users, right? For example, in Notion, you can share a page with other users and make them editors, so they can also edit this page, for example, right? And now then those changes will need to be synced to like my browser later on. So for example, if I share this page with someone else and they deleted this line, right? There should be a way that this change is conveyed to me in the browser, and then it can be delayed or it can be real time depending on the needs of the application. But uh, the state usually can be owned by many users, or it cannot. Maybe in in some cases it's not owned by many users, right? For example, like since I have not shared this page with anyone, right? I am the only person who is changing it, right? So it really, sorry. So it depends. And the third property is that it is persisted remotely, right? It as we discussed earlier, it lives in the database. And then this is asynchronous. It can take some time for this data to load, and then depending on how much data you're loading, what are the network conditions, what is the load on the server, does the server need to process this data after loading it from the database, and on all kind of things, right? And then this waiting time can be, ideally it should be less than a minute, less than 500 ms, but like it can be, sorry, less than a second, not a minute. That would be a nightmare. But like in some cases it can take 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 4 seconds, 5 seconds, right? If you're loading more a lot of data, or data that needs some processing. So in that case, right, in that case you need to show loading screens to the users. Just give me a moment. Sorry, my phone decided to ring at an unpredictable time. Okay, so these are basically some main differences between the client side state and server side state. You can treat them as same, right? Usually when uh, people use state management solutions like React Context, right? Redux, Redux Toolkit, Zustand, and things like that. Sometimes they just, whatever the data they load from the state, they then store it in that global store, and then they use it throughout the application, right? But usually that's not a good idea, because like as we have seen, these are two very different things, right? They have very different properties, and then they have very different challenges that come with them, right? And ideally we should have like separate tools managing that, right? We shouldn't be using a Swiss knife to handle everything. And although it's possible to do that, but then that causes more trouble in the future. Um, okay, and this client side state is usually managed, you could say React hooks, right? This could be managed through that, use state, use reducer, stuff like that. For example, this toggles switch is probably local to this page, right? And then probably it's just a use state. Or you could use something like React context. And so React context solves a very specific problem for us. It's not actually a state management solution as people claim, uh, but it's actually a dependency injection solution. And what I mean by that is that although we won't be diving into the details, but React context, inside the React context, you usually create the state using these React hooks, right? You usually inside the context you create a variable, and then you provide that through the provider, right? And then you also create the state setter function using the use state. And then wherever you need it, you consume that value from that context, right? But we could do the same thing using this, like for example, this use state hook itself, right? And the only problem that context solves for us is that when we provide a state through a parent, right? So when this is a parent, then all the children, child one, child two, and there's nested subchildren, subchild, right? So they can consume this state from this context directly, right? They don't have to get this state from child one as a prop, right? They can just consume this state directly. And that's really the problem context solves. Other than that, we are like we have to create this use state and then we have to use create the state setters and then and this child could get consume the state, right? And update the state using the set state function, right? Usually. Or and then this could have like subchild as well. So context is not like managing the states for us. We are usually doing that use state, use reduce or whatever, but it's it's like injecting the state into the subchildren, right? Whatever child needed, whenever the context provider is wrapped around those children, we can access the value inside the context directly in the children, right? And then like this could be a global context as well, right? We could just wrap our whole application around it and uh, sorry, we could just wrap our whole application around it, and then every component in the application can access the value from that context. But usually, the context should be again used for dependency injection to solve this problem of needing to pass the states through several child components. Uh, yeah, so this is the problem that it solves. And for example, in our project that I'm currently working on in my company, we render a tree view of questionnaires, right? So they have surveys, and then surveys have questionnaires, questionnaires have questions, and then options, and then each option can have different properties and everything, right? So we render all of that in a tree view. For example, this is also a tree view, right? So I can have nested children, right? Um, and then there are some filters on that whole tree. Uh, for example, what the user is searching for, if the user has filtered by a specific question, right? And then all of these values could be needed in any child, right? But then if one way would be that we define that in the tree component itself and then pass them through props to each child. But that's something called prop drilling, right? So if it's very deeply nested, some children might not need it, others might need it, right? For example, this children might not need the state, but we have to pass it through this tree so that this one can consume it. So that's where we use red context, right? To manage that state. So we say, okay, all the state of the filters lives inside this context provider here, and then inside wherever we need these filters, we can just access them through the context. Okay, so after that come some global state management libraries like Zustand. Redux was very famous in back in the day, and then um, so there's also some other ones, and they come with their own philosophies. For example, Redux came with its own philosophy of like actions, right? You create slices, you create stores, and then stores, and each store can have slices, and slices is basically similar state grouped together, and then you would update that state very specific way, right? You write actions, and then those actions would live within the slice. Um, Unlike context where we can just for example, if we just pass the set state uh, through the context, right? The child can call this set state and update the state in any way, right? It could just set to one SDFS, right? Or could set to one value, or could set to an object, right? So, and then this child can set the state to different set state differently, right? Although for example, if you're using TypeScript, right, compiler will say, hey, this is not allowed, right? But the thing to notice is that this state is being set in different contexts, right? uh, and then these children they appear together here, but in our application they might be scattered, so the context of how the state is updating is scattered, right? And this is one of the problems that global stores like Redux solved for us, right? So Redux said wherever you define this state in the slice, you will also define the updating functions in that slice, right? So you could just go to the slice and you could say, okay, this is the data, this is the state, and then this is how this state is updated. All the logic for updating that state would live inside the slice. So they were opinionated and they like solved this problem of the setting state logic not being scattered throughout application. And then another thing that global stores provided is that they basically said, okay, if one component consumes part of a state, right, it will re-render only when that part changes, right, from that slice. Sorry. Whereas in context, you have if you have an object with 10 keys, right, and then let's say this child consumes only one key from them, one key, right? So, and when any of the key changes, for example, let's say key 2 changed, right? This child would re-render even though it was using key 1, for example, right? It didn't need to re-render because it's the state relevant to it did not change. But like it will re-render because uh, the context, whenever context updates, it updates as a whole, right? And then this is one more problem that these global stores, for example, Redux solved, was that only the components that subscribe to that part of the state re-render. So these are some solutions that we can have to use client-side state. Yes, um, the context API is what I'm talking about when I say React context. And then for server-side state, we can use uh, Redux, we can use Just, and we can use React context, whatever. In fact, when I joined the project that I'm currently working on, they were using React context to manage the state, right? So they would just fetch the data using use effects, and then they would store it in a context. And that's how the application was working. But like, but there were some challenges with that. And those challenges that come with server-side management is that the state is not like owned on the client. They needed to handle loading states, error states, and on top of that, like usually you want the data to be cached, so it's not refreshed every time the component mounts, right? Stuff like that. Which were some of the challenges that were in that project, right? And because they were also causing performance issues. We will have a look at some of them today. So, sir, to manage server state, the tool that I like is React Query, or it's also called 10 stack query, I believe now. Earlier, it used to be called React Query. So, we will be focusing on 10 stack query today, and then we'll be seeing how we can integrate this into our app. We'll be seeing how we can have have different scenarios that we need to deal with, dealing with the async state, and how we can deal with them using 10 stack query. So, if you guys have any questions till this point, you can ask. All right, no questions. And actually, there's this very cool YouTube video. It's called React Query. It's time to break up with your global state. This you can say it's a tech talk given by Tanner Lindsley, who is the creator of React Query and 10 Stack ecosystem. Actually, they are releasing a lot of things. They have 10 stack query, they have their own 10 stack router, and they are even launching their own 10 stack framework, which is called 10 stack start, and which will be like a framework like Next.js. So I mean, this is a video that will really that helped me realized this, it was like the light bulb moment for me for state, right? Earlier, before, I just used to think of state, okay, it's just data, and then whenever I thought of state, I thought of like context API, Redux, and stuff like that. I didn't think about, is it a server-side state or is it a client-side state, right? So this is an excellent video. You guys can watch it in your own time. Okay. So let's uh, let's start doing some coding, and we'll be working on this very simple application that I created using AI. Um, and it's a simple to-do tracker. It has goals and tasks, only two things. And then we can go to the goals page. We can create new goals or fetch existing goals, right? Let's say let's create a goal. This is, and when you create a goal, the goals update, goals list updates, and then we can have tasks. Similarly, we can create a task, associate it with a goal, and then get a list of all the tasks. Um, so we have a question, that is React Query part of React or Next? React Query is not part of React. It's not also part of Next. React Query is a third-party library, right, that you can use with React and you can use with other frameworks as well. Uh, I hope that answers the question. I believe you can use it with Svelte as well and with a bunch of other frameworks. That's the reason they actually renamed it to 10 stack query now, because earlier it was React query, but then you can use it in other frameworks as well, and then it gives, the name gave the impression that you could use it only with React, but it's like framework agnostic. You can use it with they provide their adapters for different frameworks. Um, okay, so this is basically the functionality that we'll be having, and then we'll be looking at how we can fetch paginated data, having different pages, and then we'll be looking at having an infinitely scrolled page, right? So instead of just so this is again like pagination, but a different way of looking at the pages, right? So the users don't see pages, they just see this infinite scrollable uh, page, like most of the social media applications are. When you go on Facebook or on Instagram, right, you just keep scrolling, and they keep loading more content. They don't say go to the next page or to the previous page. And then we'll be looking at mutations, which is basically creating these tasks and goals and updating them. React Query is used in client side, so it's used in here, right? Useful for managing the data that I'll be fetching from the server. Okay, so let's go to the code base. This is a simple project that I created through AI. Let's have a look at the code files to see how it currently is, and then we'll start working on it to improve this. So we just have this schema, very simple schema, goals and tasks, and this is created using Prisma. We won't be modifying this. Then we have public directory, nothing, nothing important here. Then we have the source directory. Inside this source, let's have a look at the app, and then we have API directory. So this is a Next.js application, right? And as you guys might know, Next.js is a full stack framework, right? So we can have our backend and front end both in the same project, in the same repository, and manage them. And that's what we are doing here. So this API directory and its subdirectories are going to be managing our server, right? They'll be, so they, if I show you the code, right? So we have just some endpoints defined here that will be calling to fetch the data or store the data. And then these endpoints like use update the data in the database, right? So you could say this is our backend. So in the API route, we have uh, simple route for getting goals and then creating goals. Nothing important here. In the tasks, we have again different routes for getting tasks. This just finds all the tasks from Prisma and then just returns that. And then we have a way to create a task which is just some data validation and then just creates a task in the database and stores it. What is Prisma? So Prisma is an ORM. Uh, we won't be covering Prisma here, but it's usually used on the back end. So uh, you store data in the databases, right? And then those databases can be relational, like SQL databases, and non-relational, right? And then SQL databases like MySQL, PostgreSQL that we are actually using here. Uh, they use this language called SQL, right? Uh, but and that's how you interact with the database, right? But and these ORM mappers like Prisma, they provide us a way to interact with the database, and they just you could say they provide us some magic, so we don't have to write the SQL queries ourselves. For example, in this these two lines of codes, I'm saying wait prisma dot task dot find many and then order by created at ascending, right? Uh, and then just so this is reading the data from the database, right? And what this would probably do is create a query like select steric from this is the table name from tasks and then order by created at, right? So this is the SQL query that it will be creating and executing on the database, but I can just like use this pretty nice syntax. So that's what ORMs do. Okay. So a slightly off topic question, but TypeScript is better than JavaScript. TypeScript is not so TypeScript is just you could say it's a wrapper over JavaScript, right? So JavaScript, in JavaScript you don't have types, right? But it's useful to have types. They avoid us from having runtime errors, right? From doing things that should not be done, right? For example, in this Prisma, I could Prisma dot I could say something, right? Dot find many. So if we were using simple JavaScript, that would allow us, right? Because that would say, okay, Prisma dot something might exist, and then I'll just say find many on it. But because it's TypeScript, we have Prisma has defined the types, and here in our schema we define what the available types are, right? Uh, and so we are saying map this to the tasks table, right? So now it is giving me an error that you haven't defined something anywhere. Something does not exist in Prisma, so you can't. This is invalid, right? This is what TypeScript helps us to do. And in your journey, you'll need to learn TypeScript as well as JavaScript. Most of the projects use TypeScript. Okay, so this is again some endpoints, backend endpoints that we have, and then we have a paginated endpoints, which is again a simple get point, but with two additional parameters of page and per page that we'll be using. And then we have infinite endpoint. We probably don't need this. I just created it, but we can use the pages endpoint here as well. And this is and then we have the endpoints to fetch a task with a specific ID. We won't need to modify this code. You can say this is the backend that just exists, but I'm just showing it just in case. So that was our API layer, and now we have the goals and tasks. These are our main pages. So we'll see them later. And then in components, we just have a couple of helper component files like goal form, goal list, just a nav bar, navigation bar that we have, task form, which has just a form for a task and submits this, and then tasks list, which just takes a bunch of tasks and just creates the UI for that, renders that using HTML, CSS, HTML and Tailwind, sorry. And then we have this hook. I'll be discussing this later. And then we have just API, constants, Prisma, and nothing specific here. So this is how our project looks. And then obviously we are using apps router. So these subpages, these subdirectories wrap to, so they are basically what we'll have in the routes in our browser. For example, when we go to the, this is the page or TSX that goals have. So when we go to the goals, right, this is the page that will be rendered. And then when we go to the slash tasks, then slash tasks, this is the page that will render. So let's start with the goals, right? So we will first discuss fetching the data, and then we'll in the later part of the session we'll discuss the mutations of creating the data. So if we just go to our goals page, right, we are saying that there's a list of goals that is being loaded, and when we load the page, it says loading goals, right? And then it just loads the goals, and this is actually making a network request. So if I just show you guys the network tab, so here you can say it is making a network request to this localhost 3000 slash API slash goals, which is again the same application, but to this API route, and then being handled through these route handlers. I didn't want to create a separate backend, but you could say this could be like us in a separate backend in your Express app, Nest.js app, Python app, whatever, and then you just make a network request to fetch these goals. Okay, and then right now it is like working okay, I guess. We just get loading screen, it loads the goals and then displays them. Let's have a look at the code. So this is the goals page, slash goals, and this is the goals page that we have. Okay. So here we define few states, and this is like you are when you are not using any third party library, right? You are just using pure React to fetch things, right? So we have a goals state, which is our list of goals. We have is loading state, which is um, used to show loading indicator, and then error state. And then we have an effect, which is basically which has an empty dependency, which basically tells to this React to that whenever this page renders, after this page has rendered, call whatever code is in this if hook, right? And then we have load goals. So we when we load the goals, we are setting the set is loading to true. We are calling our API, right? And we have this API layer in the lib, right? And it does not do anything. It just uses simple fetch. Fetch is basically a library that you use to make network requests. It just makes a network request to the backend and then returns the response. So we won't be modifying this as well probably. So and then this could be like you could be managing this anywhere. You could just say you could be using fetch here directly as well. It doesn't matter. Focus on I have created this separately. And then once the goals load, we just set our state to those goals, and set our error to empty. And then if there's an error, we just set the error, and finally we just set is loading to false, right? So, and this is the server side state, right? Goals basically lives in our database, right? They don't live in the browser, but we are fetching them and we are storing them in the browser temporarily. So and then we have like this is pretty okay-ish UI, right? We have managed the loading state, we have managed the error state, right? So if there is an error, the error will be shown here, right? Um, let's say we just throw a new error. Sorry. So new error test, right? And then when we reload the page, now we just show the error that it failed to load the goals and no goals yet, right? So this is pretty okay, but like this isn't good enough, right? We have handled some very basic cases of loading and errors, but there are a lot of other cases that we are not handling. For example, one case that we are not handling is caching, right? So if I go back to the home page and then I go back to goals page, it is loading the goals again, even though I just loaded them, right? And they haven't changed. So I go back to the home page and then it makes another network request for goals, right? So this is just like refetching goals again and again whenever we need them. And why it is doing that is because we have, in our effect, we are saying basically whenever this component renders, just make this network request. So this is the one problem that there's no caching, right? And another problem that again stems from the caching is that this tasks page also uses goals here, right? So you select a goal when you are creating a task, right? And then this is also fetching both the tasks and goals, right? So if we clear and then refresh the page, so it is fetching both the tasks and the goals. And if I again go back to the goals page, it is again fetching the goals. And for some reason, it is also making two network requests instead of one, which is a bug. But you see the problems that we are facing, right? Uh, this is, let's just go back to our talks here. So, and then this solution you would usually, like, you won't have um, when you need goals in different pages. For example, on the tasks page, we also need goals, right? And then again, here we're defining the goals, we are loading the goals uh, here, goals API.get all, and then again, error state and all that. Um, and one way you could make it nicer is that putting these goals in a custom hook and then like calling that use goals, and then the custom hook could return something like goals is loading is error, right? Probably because of that. Probably because of strict mode, it is rendering the component twice. Okay. So we could just create a hook to like manage this state. But even then, the hook, like hook, whenever the component will re-render, the hook's context will be recreated, and then we would see the network requests again. There's no caching there as well. And also, if we need the data at multiple places, it will be refetched because for every component that uses, let's say we created a use goals hook, right? For every component that calls this hook, they will create their own instance. So that won't solve our problem. And then one thing that we could do is then actually store all of this in fetch the goals once, right? Store them in context and then provide them to our application. And then whenever we need, we just, instead of loading them from the network request every time, we would see, hey, if these goals are present if these goals are present in the React context, let's just use them, right? So we have a question, goल्स टैब में ही गोल्स की एपीआई कॉल होनी चाहिए? नहीं, गोल्स एपीआई गोल्स टैब में ही कॉल होनी ज़रूरी नहीं है. इट कैन बी कॉल्ड एनीवेयर जहाँ पे हमें गोल्स का डेटा चाहिए, राइट? बट द प्रॉब्लम इज deduplication of requests, right? जैसे फॉर एग्जांपल, so we have, let's say we have this tasks page, right? And then it loads the goals. सो फॉर एग्जांपल, हमने टास्क पेज पे अगर गोल्स फैच कर लिए हैं, राइट? हम यहाँ पे थे, हमने यहाँ पे हमें गोल्स चाहिए थे जो अभी फैच हो रहे हैं, नेटवर्क रिक्वेस्ट जा रही हैं, राइट? अब वो आ गए हैं. तो अब हम अगर गोल्स पेज पे जाते हैं तो वही गोल्स है ना, राइट? वी शुड बी एबल टू यूज दैट डाटा, एंड वन वे दैट वी कैन डू दैट इज थ्रू कॉन्टेक्स्ट, राइट? कि हम अपनी इस जो गोल्स जब हमारा फैच होता है राइट, इसको इस कंपोनेंट की स्टेट में रखने की बजाय वी स्टोर इट इन इनसाइड द कॉन्टेक्स्ट एंड देन वी जस्ट कंज्यूम दैट कॉन्टेक्स्ट। बट उसमें भी फिर उसके अपने चैलेंजेस होंगे कि फिर फॉर एग्जांपल लेट्स से कि अभी तो हमारे डेटा गोल्स बेसिकली हम ही क्रिएट कर रहे होंगे राइट, बट द वन थिंग दैट वी डिस्कस फॉर शेयर्ड स्टेट राइट, कि अगर कोई और स्टेट को अपडेट करो, डीबी में कोई और भी डाटा स्टोर करो, तो उसको हम फिर फैच किस तरह करेंगे राइट, उस रीफैच किस तरह करेंगे बार बार के यार देखने के लिए कि अच्छा किसी और ने तो नहीं नई चीज़ें ऐड कर दी। सो एंड देन लाइक दोज आर द प्रॉब्लम्स दैट विल बी facing right, and these are the problems that React Query solves for us. So if we go back, so benefits of React Query is that right. So React Query, we won't in React Query we won't need to create this separate loading and error states and then take care to set those states whenever we are trying to fetch the data and then reset those states when we like when we have the data. For example, we have to reset the error to null, right? So we won't need to do that, and then React Query will cache our data for us, right? So if, for example, if we are on tasks page and we fetch the goals, right, and then later we go to the goals page, the data will be served from the cache. It won't need to be refetched, right? Cache invalidation, React Query provides a very easy way for us to invalidate the cache. Auto refetching is something के for example, आपने आप ये कहते हैं कि यार मेरा डेटा 2-3 मिनट बाद अपडेट हो रहा है, ठीक है, आई एम एक्सपेक्टिंग द डेटा टू बी अपडेटेड, तो उस केस में प्लीज़ refresh this after this time interval, after x seconds or x minutes or whatever. For example, I have created this application PSX Worth, which is basically a stocks tracking application to track your portfolio, right? और उसमें अब ये होता है कि we refresh the stocks prices data every 2 minutes, right? तो अब अगर किसी यूज़र ने अपना पोर्टफोलियो लोड कर लिया है ऑन ऑन देयर ब्राउज़र राइट, और फिर वो उन्होंने ओपन रखा हुआ है 2-3 मिनट के लिए राइट, तो उस बैकएंड में क्या हुआ होगा कि डेटाबेस में जो स्टॉक्स की प्राइसेस हैं वो अपडेट हो गई होंगी बेस्ड ऑन द, और उसमें अब न्यू प्राइसेस स्टोर हो रही होंगी, बट वो यूज़र के पास नहीं है। तो हमें हर 2 मिनट बाद वो चेक करना है कि यार नई प्राइसेस तो नहीं आ गई, नई प्राइसेस फैच करके फिर यूआई देखो राइट। तो अब वो वाला भी अगर हमें केसेस हैंडल करने हुए तो यहाँ पे अपने कस्टम कोड से फिर हमें इंटरवल्स वगैरह यूज़ करने पड़ेंगे और फिर मैनुअली वो सारी चीज़ मैनेज करनी पड़ेगी, which React Query provides an API to do that, right? Window focus refetching React Query provides, which is basically okay, usually we are working in multiple tabs, and then whenever we come back to this tab, it should like ideally it should update the data. For example, if we were gone, for example, I open this tab. For example, we have opened this tab. And then this tab has been open all the time, right? It's been more than half an hour this has been open, right? So when we go to this tab, probably we should see if there's new data, right? If we need to. So this React query will handle this for us as well. Dependent queries, which is basically we have data from one query and then we need that as input for other query. So that is handled. Pagination is will be we'll see how we can implement pagination. Prefetching is basically sometimes, for example, if we go to the home page, right? So wouldn't it be nice if my goals are loaded, right? So when I go to goals page, I don't have to see this every time, right? I don't have to see this even for the first time. I don't have to see this loading state. So we could prefetch the goals, right? Using that query. And then polling is also again checking the backend after every x seconds minutes to see if anything has changed, and then mutations, infinite scrolling, and a lot of more cases that we can have in our journey, in our user journey. These will be handled by React Query. Actually, they'll be handled by us, but React Query provides a very nice way to manage all of these things. So let's actually start using it. Let's go to the docs, 10 stack query, search for it. 10 stack query and React query are the same things. They just renamed it to 10 stack query later on. Okay. So these are the docs which you guys should probably read as well. But if you go to the installation, there will be a simple, sorry, so there's just a simple command that we can run to install this in our project. So let's do that. Pnpm add uh, 10 stack red query. This is what we want. Right. So it has added 10 stack query and it has removed prettier. Prettier is something that we want to have and to keep. So prettier is basically a code formatting tool. The AI had not set it up, so I installed it, but in a different branch. And now because I have deleted that code that I was working on, the prettier got uninstalled again. So I'll just install it again so that whenever the whenever the code that we write, for example, there's just formatting issues, like it's just like this, and when we save, it should be auto formatted, which now it is not happening because we have deleted prettier. So let's actually install this again. I think we should have npm add prettier these are exact, right? So we should probably also create a prettier rc file. The prettier rc. So prettier rc file is basically where we can configure different settings for prettier, but we can just choose default settings, and now we are seeing that our code is being formatted when I save it. Guess we don't need this. Okay, so now we have actually installed the 10 stack library in our application, right? And now we can import things from it. For example, I could import something like import use query from 10 stack 10 stack at query, right? So but after installing it, we also need to set it up. uh, so let's have a look at that. Quick start, and then we just need to create a query client, create a provider, and wrap our application in that provider, and then we can just use that. So let's create a provider in our lib directory. Let's call it something like query provider.tsx. And then let's say how they create the provider. Okay, so let's import the query client and query client provider from 10 stack query, right? And then we will create an instance of query client is let's let's say we call it client is going to be new query client, which we're just calling this instance. And then we just need to create export default function query provider. This is our, you could say this is a React component, right? And what this React component is going to do is it's just going to return uh, query client provider. And let me actually disable this cursor. Okay, good. So we'll just use the query client provider here. And then we just provided the client instance that we created here. And then inside this provider, we will say just render whatever children we have. And this is actually the context API code, right? Providers are usually part of context API, and this is uh, like these are the concepts from context API. So, and probably they are creating a context API here. But basically, so we now have a query provider, right? To which we provide a client, and then we just render all the children inside this provider. You might ask, why do we need this client? This client is basically that will be managing the logic and everything related to the React query. For example, this will have the cache that React query uses, right? And other things, among other things. And then we are clear. defining it outside here so that it's not recreated every time this component re-render is just created once and stored on the browser side. And now we need to provide this query provider to we need to wrap this around our whole application, right? And that is inside this root app directly. We just go to the layout directory. This is where this is the our like entry point of application. This is where the main HTML and body live, and then we have navigation here. So we'll just grab whatever is inside the body in our query provider. Query provider, right? And then we just wrapped it and we imported it from the lib where we defined it. And one more reason for creating this query client here is that we can actually modify some default properties of React query that we'll see later on, right? Default options that we want to be used throughout our application. So now we have like set up 10 stack query in our application, and now we can actually start using this. And they provide different hooks. So if you go here, this is a quick start, and then go to the guides, queries. They provide this use query hook that we'll be using. Um, and then this the use query functions, parallel queries, aggregated queries probably uses the same query, infinite queries uses this use infinite query hook. So we have a lot of things that we can do, but let's just focus on our immediate needs, and that is to just fetch these goals, right? And fetching these goals is very simple. We need to import this use query hook from 10 stack. Let's say we say import use query from 10 stack query, right? And then let's comment all of this code, right? We don't need this. So we'll say const something. We'll define what it is later. Use query. And this query takes an object where we can specify different things that we want to do. And the two main things that we want to give to this query is a query key and a query function. Query key is basically, as I have told you guys, that 10 stack query provides us caching on the client side, right? So whenever we fetch data, we need to uniquely identify that, right? And we can do that through a query key. We say, for example, for these goals, we'll have to tell Red query that we want to store it this with the key of goals or whatever we want, right? We can create any query key, but we just want to React query to know that. So this is the unique key for this data, right? For tasks, we will have different key. For goals, we'll have different key, and for any other data that we might have, we'll have different key. And then query function is actually the function that React query will execute whenever we need that. Yes, 10 stack query provider provides a 10 stack to all app, right? Is it cache the same API call with no change? Query provider probably has the code to do that. Yeah. So so we'll just define a query key here, query key, and then the query key could be string, I believe, or maybe not. So query key is usually a list. It's a list of whatever you want to provide in the key. So I think so whatever you provide in the key that will be used as the query key. Sorry, whatever you provide in the query key will be used as a key. Let's say here we say this is a list of our goals, right? So our query key is goals is a list that says this is our goals. And then query function is the code that we want to execute, right? So our query function is basically this goals API dot get all. If you see to the goals API dot get all, so what this function is doing, it is calling a fetch which will create a network request. It is checking the request was okay. If request is okay, it will send the JSON. If request is not okay, it will send the Sorry, I got disconnected because of internet issues. Okay, so I have connected to a different internet. Let me know if like there are any issues in the voice or video. So I'll just share my screen. So we were discussing this goals API dot get all function. It makes a network request and then it checks if the response was okay. If the response was not okay, it throws a new error, and if the response was okay, it just returns the JSON data returned from the backend. Okay. So we tell Direct Query, hey, just use this our goals API dot get all function. This is the function that we want to use for getting the data. And this is all the code that we need to write. And what this use query provides us back is a lot of things that makes our lives easier. For example, let's use an object restructuring here. It provides us the data, right? Data is whatever will be returned from the API, whatever we return from this function, right? This function returns the data from the API, so we'll see that as data. It returns us an is pending. It is pending flag. Is pending flag will be true whenever there is no data in the cache. For example, when we just first loaded this page under application, the cache currently has nothing related to goals, right? So when this code first runs, there will be nothing in the cache. Cache will be empty and it won't have this goal, any data associated to this goals key as well. So is pending will be true. It provides us an is error flag, which will say which is a flag that will indicate if there was any error in fetching this in executing this query. It will also provide us an error, which will be the error message. I believe it's actually the error object. Yeah, so it's actually the error object which has this cause, message, name, and stack properties. It provides us an is loading property, right? Is loading property is basically whenever the network request is in transit, right? It's in progress. And then one thing to note here is that this query function could do anything. Like it could be any function that does something and returns us data. It doesn't need to. It's like framework agnostic. We could use fetch here. We could use any other thing to. We could use GraphQL. We could use Axios library here to make the network request, or it could just be a simple inline function as well. It could just be this function, right? It could just say return data, or it could just say return a list of names, right? Names, name one, name two. So And so this is like the query function is something whenever red query needs this goals data, it will say, okay, execute this function and whatever is returned from this function, store that as the value for this goals key. Okay. And then in here, we can have the logic to fetch it from the backend, from anywhere. We can use whatever we want to use. Here, red query does not complain about that. So let's get back to using our API. It provides us is loading. Is loading basically whenever this promise is pending, right? It's in progress. And then a few other things that we don't need right now. Sorry. So these are the things that it provides us out of the box, right? So let's we have an error here. Our compiler is complaining. It is saying error is not defined. Sorry, error is defined, but it is saying error has a type of error which is not assignable to React Node. So this is the error returned by React query. We'll just say just error dot message, render error dot message. And then goal form is saying on success load goals, which is something that we were using. So previously, how it was working is, um, so whenever we created if we go to the goal form, when we create a new goal, we are calling the API directly here. We would just call this on success, and this on success would refresh the data, right? So it would say, I have created a new goal. Now we should probably refresh the goals. So we don't need this here right now. Let's just remove this on success. On success is just removed. And then I need this here as well. Okay. And then goals list needs a bunch of goals, which is basically our data that is returned now. So if you see data has a type of goals list or undefined, right? And then we'll just say data dot actually just pass the data as is. And then is loading is the flag from React query. So, and then there's also, sorry, is loading is not true when data is in progress actually. That is fetching. When the promise is pending, is fetching flag is true, right? And then is loading is combined combined value of is fetching and is pending. So as you can see, is loading is true whenever the first fetch or for query is in flight. So when is fetching is true and is pending is true, then is loading will be true. Uh, So we don't need a lot of these. We don't need all of these. Let's just say we don't need this is error. We only need this is pending flag, right? So is pending flag will display our loading state. So it'll say is loading whenever it's pending. Basically, we are saying whenever there's no data in the cache, just display the loading state because probably it's that's being fetched right now. And then when there's data, just this is the data that we want to have. Okay, let's try to refresh. Okay, so we are getting an error that only plain objects can be and a few built-in can be passed to client components from server components. So this is a next specific error because next specific has both next has both client and server components and React also has them. But we need to mark every client component as use client in next, which we have not done for our this query provider, right? This is supposed to be run on the client side, so we need to mark this as use client component. And now the error should be gone. Okay. So now we go back to the pages, our goals page that we're working on. So we have this state. And now we go back to the goals again. We see the network request. Uh, sorry, we just see the network request, and then this was some next related. Hmm, I think this was the payload for the server component. But now you see One problem that got fixed here was that earlier in strict mode, because of strict mode, every component was being rendered twice, and we were seeing two goals requests, right? But now we are seeing only one goal request. How is that possible? That is because React Query manages another problem for us, and that problem is probably I didn't add it here, but that problem is request deduplication, right? And what that really means is that if on in this page we needed goals only here, right? But let's say we needed goals at the bottom as well. In that case, in our previous approach, like there will be two network requests. But React Query is smart enough to know that, okay, so that if there is already, whenever this query function is executing, right? So React Query has created some metadata related to it for this key, right? So when it knows that goals are already being fetched from the network, there's no need to send this request again, right? So now, when the second time the component re-renders, the React query actually deduplicates that request. It says, okay, goals are already being fetched, and whatever component will need the data, I'll just serve that from the cache. Okay. And as you can see, this has already made things very simpler for us, right? We don't have to worry about creating is loading state and then setting is loading to true and setting error to true, resetting the error, setting it to true when there is an error, and then resetting the loading state, right? We don't need all of those. We don't need them. We simply use the use query. We tell it, we give it a query key. We say goals, and then we just give it the function that it needs to execute, and it provides us this beautiful API, and then everything that just works. And then now our goals fetching is managed through React Query. Okay. Now if I go to the home page and I come back to the goals page, you see it again sends the network request. I come back to the goals page and it sent a network request for the goals, right? But didn't I just say that React Query has caching, and then like this should not be happening if the data is cached, then it should be served from the cache, right? And for that, we need to discuss something called scenarios of data refetching, right? And then another thing marked as stale time. So stale time is one more key that we can pass to our use query object. We can say stale time of 5000, and this is the time in milliseconds. The time in milliseconds after data is considered stale. If set to infinity, the data will never be considered stale. If set to a function, the function will be executed when the query compute to uh, stale time, and it defaults to 0, right? So React Query has this pattern of stale while revalidate, right? And stale time basically tells the React Query that for how much time this data is going to be fresh, right? After what time should we refresh this, right? So let's say, for example, here we have set 5000 milliseconds as the time, which is basically saying 5 seconds. And now we are telling that query, hey, this data is stays fresh for 5 seconds. So now if just we fetch the goals once, right? We go to the home page, come back, it is not making the network request again, right? But then it is making it after, probably because 5 seconds have passed. Let's increase it to 10,000. Now our cache time is 10 seconds, right? Now we go to goals, it fetched the goals. Then we went to home page and then we came back. Now it is not fetching those goals. It is not, this is the server component request. This is our actually our network request. See, now no data is being fetched and we also don't see any loading state. And then it now revalidated the error. Sorry, revalidated the data, right? And after this time has passed, if the data is still needed, React Query will serve the data from cache but refetch it in the background. Okay. And actually, so React query does not always refresh the data. Like that is actually polling, right? So we could polling is something that have we are doing something that happens after every specific interval, right? For example, we say refresh goals data every 10 seconds, after every 10 seconds. After every 10 seconds, refetch goals data, right? So this would be polling, right? But here we are saying after every this is polling. Here we are saying after 10 seconds have passed, mark this data in the cache as stale, right? Which is basically this data is not fresh and should probably be refreshed when it is used again. But let's switch it back to 5 seconds, right? Reload the page. Now our goal is loading, right? We go to the home page, wait for some time, and nothing happens, right? 5 seconds have passed, but Red Query has not refreshed it, right? Even though in the cache it has marked this goals data as stale, right? But this data is stale does not mean that it will be refreshed. So it will be refreshed when certain condition is met, right? One of them is that when this goals component re-renders, right? Whenever the component that this in where this use query is used is remounted, right? So we go back to the goals page, it will serve the stale data, but it will make a background network request, right? And so because the data was stale, it made a background request. If the data was not stale, it would not refetch it in the background. And those four conditions are when the React query does the refetching is when the query key changes. If a query key change and the query is stale, React query will refresh the data and update the cache, right? So if for whatever reason our query key change, it will update the data. The second condition is that a new observer mounts, right? And observers are created by use query. So React query uses this pattern of observers. So we have this data that has a query key of goals, right? For example, in our tasks page, let's actually, we also need these goals data in the tasks page, right? So let's actually replace that with use query. Okay, so we don't need these goals. We don't need these goals. Um, let's let's actually replace both tasks and goals, right? So const, let's say data as we'll say this is tasks, and then we'll say is loading or error from, then we'll just use the use query, and then we pass it an object with different configuration. First value is that what is are going to be query key. Let's say we call it tasks query, and then query function, which is going to be this API function task API dot get all, right? We don't call this, we just provide it, and then this is tasks, and then we also need goals, so we just say data as goals, right? Let's keep the is loading an error for goals for now is equal to use query, and then just query key with goals and query function with goals API dot get all. Okay, so we don't need this now, don't need this effect, we don't need this load data, nothing. So in here, you just need to error dot message. No, we don't need this. Let's actually say this on success is just an empty function for now. And then goals, tasks. Okay. So we have our tasks page working as well. So we are seeing that network requests are sent for tasks and goals. So let's do one thing. We have tasks page, goals page. Let's close this. Let's keep open the goals page, and let's also open the query provider. So one reason for creating this client and then providing it in the provider was that we can create some default options, right? That will be, and those options will apply to all the use query or use mutation hooks inside that are used inside that are children of this query provider. One thing that we can do here is, let's say, what does it take? It takes config. Okay, and then it says queries. Hmm, saying object literal may only specify config does not query client config. Hmm. Let's actually see. Let's actually ask our AI. Sorry, not this. How can I configure a my query client? What is the syntax for it? So configuration object, yeah. So default options actually. So we pass it an object with the key of default options, and then we specify options for queries. Let's say we say stale time of 5000 ms, right? So now we have set a global default option that will be respected by all the children of this query provider. That includes both our tasks and goals page. So now we don't need to specify this stale time here. We could specify it here, right? But let's say we don't specify it here. We say, let's say we specify it here, and then if you go back, okay, undefined reading map. So initially this data is false. Let's just return if uh, no tasks or uh, no goals, just return false, return null. We'll just use it for the time being so that our application runs. But now if you go to the goals page, right, go back, it is not sending the goals network request, right? So this is the actually goals network request, and it sent that only once, right? And why is that? Because it is respecting the stale time from our global config, right? And if we want to, we can override that in any specific place. For example, here we could say, you know what, actually set the stale time to 0 for this query. And now when it is provided both in the global config and the use query instance, the use query instance one will be followed. Now if we go back, go to the goals, see if we fetch the goals, go to home page, go to goals again, we refresh the goals, right? Because now we are saying React query, the stale time is 0. So it is marked stale as soon as it is loaded, right? And whenever we just remount this component, it refetches it in the backend background. So for this tasks page, we have this. Uh, so now we have this global stale time of 10 seconds, right? And one beautiful thing that we will now see is that we are calling this use goals query here, right? Goals data, we are getting it here in the tasks page, and we are also getting it on the goals page, right? Now, if I go to the tasks page and okay, now let's refresh. So it will fetch both the tasks and goals, right? Now I see I have a goals list here. Now if I go to the goals page, the data is already there, right? It is served from the cache. There's no network request for it. Okay. Uh, but the concept that I wanted to discuss was that when a new observer mounts. So now what is happening on this goals query, there are two components that basically needed this data, the tasks page and the goals page, right? But if we go back to let's say if we were at the tasks page, right, we fetch the goals once, but let's wait for 10 seconds so that this goals data is actually and tasks data both are marked as stale, right? So what will happen is that once they are marked stale, when we go to the goals page, that is basically saying a new observer is mounting because we are needing this data in a new place. that we were not using it before because we have refreshed the page, right? So right now only tasks page says I need goals, right? So if now 10 seconds have passed, now I go to the, so the goals data must be marked stale inside our query cache, right? So now if I go to the goals page, you see it will refresh the goals in the backend, right? So this is when a new observer mounts and the query data is stale, right? It will refresh in background. And the third is when window receives a focus event, and that's again obviously, let's say that after 10 seconds this is now marked stale, and I go back to some other tab, right? And then I go back to this tab after 10 seconds. When the data is stale, it will refresh the goals. Okay, and the fourth is when the device goes online. The fourth is when we, if the device went offline and then it came back online and some data was marked as stale, it will refresh it in the background. So these are all the four conditions when a data is refreshed. We can't actually see the fourth condition right now because that would also mean that maybe we can go offline here, and then we can go online. Yeah, you see, I went offline, and when my network request came, it, because the data was marked as stale, it repatched it. Let's say we went to our query provider and we set a very large stale time. Now our data won't be marked stale for a long time, right? And now once the goals are fetched on page load, right? So one thing to note is that this cache remains active as long as the page is active, right? That's how React works. Whenever we go to a page, it fetches all the code for that page, and if we reload it, then it refetches all the code, right? So now because we have set a very long stale time, the goals query is will you, like it's not marked as stale now. So now whatever we do, if we go to the tasks page, only tasks are refreshed and not goals, right? Go back to goals page, no goals are refreshed. Go back to tasks page, only tasks are, even tasks are not now refreshed. Nothing is refreshed now. You see, we go offline, we come back online, nothing will be refreshed because the data is not marked as stale. So these were some of the concepts of fetching the data, when it will be refreshed, the sale time, the caching, um, um, and like how all of this works together. So if you guys have any questions until this point, you can ask now. It's not saved in the browser cache, I believe. React Query, I think React Query creates its own, you could say, an object and then stores everything there. Like it's different from the browser cache. Which scales first, global or component? So whatever we set, whichever value is lower, right? So if this global value is very big, and in our goals page we say stale value of stale time of 5,000, which is 5 seconds, then this data will be marked stale after 5 seconds, right? And if similarly, if this was very big, right, and then our global was very small, what do you think happens in this case? In this case, the React query will still honor this stale time, right? The data won't be marked stale because React query says, okay, you created a global configuration for everything, right? But then in a very specific instance, you overrided that, right? So you as the developer know that this data is different, right? This is an edge case, right? This is data that doesn't rely on the global configuration. It has its own configuration, right? So you are saying this data can stay in the cache fresh for a longer period of time. Yeah. So this is just basically saying if there is both global and query specific config, uh, prefer the query specific config, right? Okay, any other questions? So you guys got the point, right? This is already very an improvement over what we had earlier, right? We are getting a lot of functionality um, with a very little code, right? A- And also, this isn't like very hard to understand. This is actually very easy. This is one of the goals of React Query and what its creator Tanner Lensley says, and they say that most of you can get 80% of the functionality, 80% of the functionality by knowing only 20% of the things, 20% of the you know syntax of React Query, right? So in most scenarios, you can just you can know a very few things about React Query and get and handle most of your scenarios. And for some complex scenarios that we'll see later on, for example, pagination, infinite implementing infinite pages, right? Infinite implementing optimistic updates, then you obviously get some more things, right? So with complexity, you can use the complex syntax, but like for bare bones functionality, this is very simple, right? Yeah, so polling, actually, let's now that we're here, let's different. So stale, I have explained to you guys that when a data is marked as stale, like it is not immediately refreshed, right? So we have this data in cache, let's say it gets stale after 5 seconds, right? And then we go to our page, goals page, right? Let's uh let's remove this, right? Let's We are on the goals page, right? So we refreshed our application. We will now refresh the goals, right? But now let's stay on this page for 5 seconds, right? So it is not refetching, right? It is not, even though 5 seconds have passed, it is not refetching. In the backend, it has marked this data as stale, right? But it won't refetch it just now. It will refetch only when one of these four conditions are met. First condition, the query key changes, or a new observer mounts, or the window receives a focus event. For example, now if I go to another tab and go back, now it will, one of that event has occurred and the data was stale, so it refreshed. And the fourth one is when the device goes online, right? And the polling is very different. Polling is different from stale time. Polling is basically saying, and how do you implement polling in React Query? Very simple. You just use this refetch interval key, and let's say 2000, right? And this refresh interval says to React Query, okay, keep refreshing data of this query key every 2 seconds. Now we go back to the goals page. You see, it is refetching, and now it is refetching again after 2 seconds, even though like we haven't done anything else, right? So this is polling. Polling is basically you always keep refetching data after every 2 seconds when it is active, right? When the component that needs this is there, right? But sale time was different from that. And inside polling, inside this refresh interval, we can again pass a function as well. The function be executed with the latest data and query to uh, compute of default, so to false, right? So we could again, let's say, pass a function again, which just returns, let's actually use the syntax return 2000, right? Again, now again, this is just keep polling for the data from the backend every 2 seconds, keep making the network request every 2 seconds. But this is useful, right? This is useful in a way that, for example, there was a long running job on the backend, something that was happening on the backend. Let's say it could take anywhere between 30 to 50 seconds, right? So you just want to keep checking the status for that. You just want to know, hey, has this job completed? Has this job completed? Has this job completed or not, right? So you could keep polling for it every 2 seconds or every 1 second, right? But once that job completes, you don't need to do that, right? So uh actually it provides this, I think, data dot, okay. So ideally, in this refresh interval, we would be able to access the data dot length. Um, but let me actually see what it passes to the query. Can you please tell me what is the first argument passed to the refresh interval when I use the function syntax? Okay, right. So, but based on a condition, right? For example, we were polling for that long running job, and the backend was saying, hey, the job is still in progress, that job is still in progress, right? So we keep the refresh interval going until the job was in progress, but the backend then says the job has completed now, right? And then we would say, okay, the job is completed, in that case return false, so the polling stops, right? So if we just return false, you see there will be no polling now. So see, it's not refetching, polling for the data, not refetching. And this is actually very complex use case. Polling is like, it's not easy to implement usually, but Red Query just like provides us this very simple API that we can use to, and then it just abstracts away all the complexity related to it. So it's saying when refetch interval is a function, it requires first the data, right? So the first argument is the query data that was returned from the query function. The function should return a number in milliseconds to disable the refetch. So is that clear? Got an RSC component where you say next payload server. Yeah, RSC component is this one. Yeah, I think this is probably the server payload. Yeah, see. So this is the RSC payload, which is basically the component first render. This actually, why is this? So basically the page first renders on the server, and then it sends this payload, which is then constructed on the front end. And then any other uh, front end related functionality that is required, that's then again, this component is again rerun on the front end, and the page is then hydrated, which is basically any changes that are in the page are applied. But that's not what we are discussing today, not server components. Okay, so let's quickly move on. We have discussed polling now. We have discussed fetching scenarios, deduplication. We have discussed deduplication, right? So like if multiple components needed this data on the same page, when we were using our own use effect thing, or we were even we created our own use query or context, there would be no way to deduplicate that unless we wrote the code ourselves. But that query handles this for us out of the box. Then enabled is Boolean value to use query. Yeah, okay. And then similarly to this stale time, we have another thing which is called enabled flag. Enabled flag is basically saying, enabled is basically when enabled is true, only then this query will execute. If the enabled is false, this query won't execute, and this could be useful in some cases, right? For example, let's see what. For example, if you see this task, let's say where this task is defined. actually it's a right. So this task has ID, title, description, goal ID, right? It does not have the goal information, right? So if we just went to a task slash, let's say, I don't know what is the ID. Let's see ID of some task, right? Okay, so just go to this ID, task slash ID. Okay, the page. Okay, so tasks, you don't have a page for task slash ID. Let's actually quickly create a page just to show this functionality. Let's put it on agent mode. Can you create a detailed task page that takes the task ID and renders the task, and then it should fetch only that specific task, and that when that task is fetched, it should fetch the goal for that task is related to, and then display both of them. Okay. So it will just implement that for us. Yeah. So our cute little AI must have implemented this for us now. Mm, no, tasks slash ID. Okay. So the UI is actually tasks and not task. You see, this page will fetch a single task, right? It will make a request to fetch a single task, and then it will fetch the related goal, right? And so this is where we'll be probably be using the enable flag, right? So you see here, it's saying if there is no task ID, right, there's no need to fetch that, right? So enable flag is false. Similarly, when there is no task.goal ID, right, don't fetch a goal, right? So without this enabled flag, let's say we don't have this enabled flag, right, and reload the page, you see it made the request for that task and then for that goal, but it should okay, get the ID. Where is the goal ID coming from? So let's say the goal ID is 1, then this is the side, right? Now refresh. So you see the task has been fetched successfully to start fetching this goal ID, right? So, and then we just use enable flag to start task dot ID, only then it is enabled, right? And we probably just want to refresh this. So you say enabled, this is enabled when there's a task.goal ID. So now it will refresh when there's a task. So now it will first execute this query and then it will execute this query. Does that make sense or is it confusing? Let me know if you guys didn't understand it. Okay, so I guess you did understand it. So we discussed deduplication, polling, enabled flag as well. And then let's now discuss pagination, right? And then we have another page where we just fetch these tasks 5 by 5, and then we have like total we have 9 tasks. So we have 2 pages, right? Then we go back. You see, right now it is using our own initial implementation, right? So it is using the use effect and manual fetch calls. And you might notice that whenever I'm switching between pages, it is refetching the data again and again, right? Because it does not have any concept of cache. So if I just go to our tasks pagination page, sorry, not in routes, not in API, inside this pagination page, and then we close everything else. You see, it is using our initial approach that we started with. It is saying data current page is loading error. So the only additional thing now that we have is that this page current page state, right? And when user clicks on previous, this page state updates to what it is current -1. So if I just go to this button, right? So on the previous button click, we reset the we subtract one from the current page, and on the next button click we add one to the current page, right? You can already notice some issues with it, right? So like when I'm switching between pages, even though I fetched this page just a second ago, right? But then it is again showing me loading states. And let's actually make this page size very small. So in this task API.get paginated function, we have page as parameter and per page as parameter, right? So let's say per page we only want to show 2 entries. It is defaulting that to 5, I believe. Now if we refresh, right? See, now it is showing 2 entries, right? Now basically we just have more pages now, right? So we fetched all the pages and then let's go back, right? So try to go back to the first page quickly. Oh, sorry. So it just it, it shows the loading state, and also these pagination controls are not shown, right? But let's assume that these pagination controls can always be on the page, right? They're not dependent on the data. For example, this is not dependent on the data, and neither are the pagination controls, right? So we need to move them out of our loading state, right? So this is loading is true, then submit the loading state. If there is data, then show this data, and then after this, let's see. So inside this div, we actually want to always render pagination controls. Okay. Let's remove this for now. We don't need it. We don't need this as well. Right, we don't need this as well. So now we just have our pagination controls. Now if we quickly switch between pages, sorry, let me just reload. So there's another problem with our current approach, and that is that when we quickly switch between pages, a race condition occurs, right? Let me quickly switch between pages. You see, multiple network requests are in progress, right? And you see, you've seen the flickers, right? So when multiple network requests are in progress for the pages, we don't know which request will return the result first or last, right? For example, let's modify our API to do this. Like, let me just refresh this page so you guys know what is on the second page. We'll just store the data on second page. Okay, so this is our first page. This is our second page. It has tasks 7 and 6. So let's just store it. That second page uh, prints tasks 7 and 6. So since we have no way to control how, in real scenarios, we have no ways to control how much time the backend will take to respond to a request, right? Let's say if our page number was, so we just want to simulate that if page is equal to 2, we just add await new promise dot resolve for 5 seconds, right? So we are simulating a situation in which if the page number is 2, the data will take more time to load as compared to other pages, right? So now let's refresh our application, right? Okay. So now let's quickly switch between the pages. Okay. You see, one issue is that it is showing flickers whenever the requests resolve, but the other issue is that where is the page to? Hmm. Let's let's wait for even more time. Then page is 2. Let's go back. Refresh. Okay, now page is 1. Hmm. Okay. So let's fetch multiple pages again, right? You see, so we are on the page 4, but it will make the request for page 2, right? So what happened here is that because this page 2 request uh, returned the response at last, even though we are on page 4, right? We are on page 4. It is showing the data from page 2. You see the problem? Because we had to no way of controlling how the server would respond. It is actually showing the wrong. Okay. So am I audible? Yeah. So because of this race condition, what actually happened is that I am on page 4, like I click this button 4 times, but it is showing me data from page 2, which is wrong. This is not the right state that I expect to be on. But because this page 2 promise resolved in the last, it is showing that. And then there were also flickers. So this isn't something that we want. We want better experience for our users. So let's just make it 3000. Right. So let's start using pages. Let's do it using our red query. Again, tasks API. And then let's just have one state for current page that we already had. And let's disable this cursor for some time. It is again becoming annoying. Let's so 5 minutes. Okay. So again, we have the use query here. We are fetching the tasks, and then we are, let's say we do it like we did it earlier, right? Data is loading error dot message. Let's say we have it here, right? And So again, and then for this page, we'll just pass it current page and then two. Okay, let's refresh. And actually let's console.log our current page variable. Current page, okay. Okay. So let's go back to, so we are going to next and previous pages. If we click on console, our current page is changing, right? It is now 10, 9, 11, 10, 12, 13, right? 16, 14, right? But our data is not refetching. Can anyone share why from this code? Can you guys guess what's wrong with this code? Why is our data not refetching? Even though our current page is changing, we are passing this to the our tasks API. Why is this? Why is the data not fetching? Dependency issue. What do you mean by dependency issue? So the problem is this with this key, right? As I have explained earlier, React query stores the data in cache, and we have the set the stale time to 5,000. Let's set it to 10,000. So we are saying when you fetch tasks, right? Just this is the key for tasks, and then this is the function that you call, and you pass this function the current page and pass this too, right? But React query does not know that we are fetching paginated stuff or whatever we are doing inside this function. It just calls this function and stores whatever is returned in the cache, right? So actually the problem is with this query key. We are saying we are fetching tasks and store that in the cache, right? So when the page current page changes, React query, when execute this, when this component re-renders, React query says, okay, I need to check for tasks in my cache. Tasks का data already वहाँ पे पड़ा है, तो फिर वो उसको it won't call this function, right? This query function won't be called again, and therefore our data is not refreshed, right? Because this key is not changing. So what we need to actually do is we also need to uh, pass this current page as our query key. So now the query key would actually be, if you go here and if you say it as const, right? So query key is going to be tasks and and a number, and that number would be current page, right? So we are saying whenever, so now this query key, let's say, uh, when the current page is 1, the array would be tasks and 1. And when the current page is 2, the array would be tasks and 2, right? And when it is 3, the array would be tasks and 3. Okay. So now and whatever values are passed, they are combined to create one key by React query. Okay. I think they are stringified or something. Let me just ask our buddy AI. How does React query handle this array that I passed as query? How does, like, does it convert to JSON? Does it convert to a string? How does it create a unique key from that? Okay. So so now every combination of task and current page will get like a different cache key. And now when we switch pages, you see we are back back in business. We are making the network requests again, saying page 9, right? When you go to previous, the page changes, right? Let's refresh again. Okay. So if we go to the next page, you see the page 2 is being called. Actually, we should just modify this API to await after the network request so that we actually know that the request is running, right? We go to next page, it is now fetching that page. Okay, is this clear, guys? So we actually needed to add this current page to our query key. And usually whatever the arguments of this function would be, they should be part of the query key as a good practice to ensure that whenever any of those arguments change, this query key also refetches, right? For example, if we also gave user ability to show how many records per page they see, right? Usually when go to websites, they have this ability. You can modify the number of per page elements that are being displayed, right? In that case, this won't be a constant too. This would be again a state const per page and set per page, right? And then per page, and then we just provide a select here, previous button, and then let's create a select here, select value per page, right? So now we have this value, how many elements we want to show per page, right? But again, nothing is happening because this per page is not in the query key, right? So we should actually have it in the query key. So now when you change per page, right? Now we're seeing 4 elements per page. I change it to 2 and you see it made a network request for that, right? So usually whenever whatever the values are passed to this query function, they should be part of the query key. So our AI saying when you pass an array React query, it serializes that to a string. React query serializes the array to into a deterministic string. It does not use JSON.stringify directly. It uses custom serialization that handles primitive strings, numbers, booleans, null, undefined, nested arrays, objects, right, and hashing. Okay, so AI is basically telling us that whatever values we pass here, we could also pass some objects, like do with some this object with this value, right? And then React query will internally serialize that using a custom algorithm, and then it will create a hash for that, and that hash actually would be the query key. Depends on your current page, that is above it's the same as a current page query key. Yeah. Yes, you are partially right. So query key is basically actually the cache key, and unless the query key changes, uh, the React won't update the data, right? Even though we are updating these state variables, but our 10 stack query or the cache is not concerned with those state variables unless we pass them to our function and pass them to our query key itself. Okay, guys. So we have this pagination example now working, right? Let's see, right? So it fetches the next pages, previous pages. And now one issue is resolved because now we have caching. When we switch between already fetched pages, it does not show loading states again and again as opposed to earlier when we were seeing this issue, right? Let's actually set our cache to an even larger value so we can observe this even better. Okay, we are also out of time. So the first time it is fetching the page, it is showing the loading state, and the second time. But if we now go back to the pages that we have already fetched, you see no loading states because they are being served from the cache. But we can, but when the first time the pages are being loaded, right? So loading tasks is fine, right? So we are fetching the first page. When we go to the next page, again, we are seeing this loading screen. Maybe it is good, maybe it is not good, right? But generally, like if I am on a page, I should like we should keep this data that is being displayed to the user until that page is fetching. And React Query provides us a way to do that as well. And that is through an argument called placeholder data. So placeholder data says when the query is fetching, what data should we show, right? And then here we say placeholder data, keep previous data. Keep previous data comes from this package again. So this basically tells React Query when the data when new page is being fetched, just keep displaying the old page, right? The data of the old page, right? So we're fetching the page one. We go back, we're fetching the page two, but we keep seeing the data of page one until that page two request completes, right? And then based on this, we can actually use another value returned from this is placeholder data, right? A flag that will be returned from this query, and we can use it to do something like this to give feedback to the user that more tasks are loading inside our, where is the data we are rendering? Yeah, here we are rendering the data, right? So this is our main wrapper class. We could say, we could replace this with string template literals. Yeah. So let's say when is placeholder data, we are setting the opacity. Okay. So now you see when you're fetching the next page, it like blurs, it renders the page with less opacity, right? So user gets the feedback that the page is being fetched, right? But we keep showing the previous data. This is better than what we had earlier, right? Or if we want to, we could even show a custom loading indicator based on this flag. Is this clear, guys? Yes, okay. And let's quickly, we're also running out of time. Let's quickly learn about one more thing, which is prefetching. So, uh, so we have this query, use query, right? And then we also have something called use prefetch query. Okay. And let's say this prefetch query is tasks current page plus one. Can. Okay. So this use query comes from 10 stack query, and this use prefetch query also comes from 10 stack query. But we can use this prefetch query to prefetch some data ahead of time, right? And the difference between these is that use prefetch query does not return anything. You see, its return type is void, whereas use query returns all these things that it returns the use query return result, right? We can use this use prefetch query to do a lot of useful things. Let's actually see that in action, right? So we have our home page, right? From here, when the user wants to go to the goals page, right? They will click on it, go to the goals page, and our goals will be fetched. Why is this goals page? Why are we not seeing the network request? Okay, let's go to the goals page now. Something is wrong. Oh, because we have enabled set enable to false when we were learning about this. So now we are on the home page. We go to the goals page and goals are fetched, right? Once the page loads, we make a network request for goals. But one thing that we can do to improve the user experience is we could prefetch the goals when, for example, when they hover over this, right? We know they are probably going to load these goals, right? And so we could do one thing in our navigation, right? So these are all the links. We could have here something like on these goals, when on mouse enters, right? On mouse enters, what we'll do, we will actually access the query client here, const query client is going to be use query client, right? So we access the global query client that we created in context in the query provider, right? So we will say when these goals on mouse enters on these goals, do what? Query client. Let's disable this again for some time. It can becoming annoying. Query client that prefetch query, right? And what is our goals query? This is the this is what it contains: goals query and query function, right? Goals API. We need to import this, right? So we are basically saying when the mouse enters on this link, we need to prefetch this query. We need to make a network request for this query. Here's how this would work. Okay. Yeah. So now again, we are getting an error that use query client is being called from server because this navigation, if you guys see, it is rendered inside our layout page. Our layout page does not the use client directive, so it is a server component. And then this navigation also does not use the use client directive, so it is also a server component. And that's why React is throwing an error. It is saying you can't use hooks inside server components. So let's make it a client component. Yeah. Now the error will be gone. But now we have we'll see something very interesting. When we hover over these goals, it has already made the network request for goals, right? And when now we go to the goals page, the goals data are already there. Let's see that one more time. When we hover over the goals, it makes a network request. When you go to the goals page, the goals are already loaded, right? And so this is useful when you want to give user the illusion of speed, right? Or illusion of network being fast, right? So if this goals request takes, let's say, 1 second to load, and by the time user hovers over it and they click, right, there is going to be a time period, let's say 200 ms, 300, 400 ms, right? And by the time user clicks on it, half of the request would already have progressed, right? So we are basically trying to give the illusion of speed, right? By prefetching this. Let's see this one more time, right? So sorry, I have set my network to slow 4G. That's why our pages are loading so slow. Okay, now we're good. Now we're Gucci. So let's hover over the goals page, go to the goals page, right? But the network was already pending. It is taking like 4 5 seconds, and that's why we are not seeing that that much benefit, right? But let's try again and hope it takes less time this time. No, again it's taking 2.9 seconds, right? But if the request took like 5 seconds, then sorry, 500 milliseconds or 1 second, then this like the user would feel that uh like they do not have to wait, there won't be no loading state, right? When we come here now, the user perceives this as very low loading time, as opposed to tasks page, where once the page loads, then we start fetching tasks, and then once they load, we show them. Is this clear, guys? And then we could do something here inside our pagination goals. Actually, let's and I'm going to use cursor here because we are almost out of time and also want to discuss mutations, right? So let's prefetch next page, right? Just prefetch query. Okay. So now what is going to happen is when we go to our pagination, so now we are fetching two pages, right? When I go to the page two, it will prefetch the page three. And the user will get the illusion that like the user will get very less loading screens, right? So earlier when I loaded the next page, I had to wait for the loading screen to complete. But now uh, like I don't one page is already being preloaded for me. When I go to the next page, one page is being preloaded for me. If I click very quickly, right? If I click very quickly, then obviously I'll see that because not all the pages are loaded, right? Right. So now I'm seeing the pending state, but usually users won't be clicking that quickly. And if you want, maybe you can, fetch two pages, prefetch 2 pages, 3 pages, depending on your whatever your needs are. Our next page is already, yeah. So our next page is already fetched and in our cache. And this is how actually the high performance applications work a lot of the time. So they do this a lot of prefetching, a lot of optimistic things, and we perceive their time as uh, like near to instant. They already have very optimized APIs. So uh, like realistically, this is a very simple page. Realistic, this is a very simple endpoint, so it should not be taking 3 seconds to load. 3 seconds is a long lot of time for network request. But I haven't optimized the backend, nor I don't know how the DB is connected. Uh, so, but when you are trying to optimize for hundreds ms, 200, 500 ms, right? And these are the things when you're trying to optimize for in production, in consumer facing applications, then this prefetching and this caching and then prefetching next page, this improves the user experience drastically. Okay, so I actually wanted to see this infinite scroll as well. Let's actually get this implemented from the AI because we are almost out of time. uh, so we'll see, update it to the agent. And can you update the infinite page example to use React query, and specifically use infinite query? Okay. So now this will do coding for us, and I'll get to you guys. So basically, again here in this page as well, we will be fetching data pages by pages, but we won't show users page numbers, right? We'll say, okay, when the user has is scrolling and they have scrolled to the bottom of the page, like fetch the next page, right? And at the end of this, there's no tasks load, like automatically fetch the next page. Okay. So if you see the changes that it has done, or it is using use infinite query instead of use react use query, right? So use infinite query is another hook that is provided to us by Tense React Query. It's similar to use query, but it provides us these additional additional things we can pass to it. We can pass to its initial page parameter. We can't pass that to use query. Let's say this is use query. Try passing it to initial page parameter. It will say no, 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 you can't do that. But we can do that with infinite query. So this is managing the pagination state for us. You see, there's no now page state here. So we are saying initial page parameter is one, and how do you get the next page parameter? You say the last page data. This is past three things: last page, all pages, and then the last page parameter. You guys can read about more about the details in the documentation, right? But here we are basically telling React Kitty how to get the next page from the current page, right? So we are saying if last page that has more, then just add one to the pagination, right? Or we could just simply say last page parameter and add that to one, whatever it was initial. Let's give it a type number. Okay. So we are saying if last page has more pages, then increase the page number by one. Does this make sense? Initially it will be one, and the next time this function gets called, it will be two, and then three and four. Okay. And then we have another, and then this also returns us fetch next page function. We were not using we were not using this in the use query, but this basically allows us to fetch the next page. And we can have a button here where user will click to fetch the next page, right? But we are doing that, we are fetching the next page programmatically by using this hook, right? Use infinite scroll hook. This is a custom hook that I have created, right? So it basically takes a callback function and root. Yeah. So it returns a reference, a ref that is a use ref, but basically it is saying whenever whenever the entry is an entry is basically going to be this element. Whenever the element is intersecting what? Intersecting this root, right? Call the callback function. And this basically implements the functionality where, let's just wait for it to loading more tasks. So where if there are more tasks, it just loads the next page. Does this make sense? Sorry, I'm just moving too fast through here because almost out of time. But you guys can learn more about it in the talks. I just wanted to show this to you guys because it's cool. And we can implement it very easily using React Query. Okay, so now quickly see the mutations actually, right? The creating the data. And let's close all of this. Let's go to the open the tasks page. And now we have this task form. We have this handle submit button, and then set is submitting true, set error. Again, we are creating these custom states for managing this, right? And then our actual function is calling this tasks api.create. And to manage the mutations or creations, React Query provides us another beautiful hook called import use mutation. Use mutation, right? And its API is very similar to the uh, use query API, right? Or the syntax. By API I mean syntax. So const use mutation, right? And then you see we call the use mutation, right? We say this is the mutation function. We can pass it a mutation key, like tasks create, let's say call it. But this key is optional. While for fetching use query, this key is mandatory. Here it is optional. We can provide it and use it if later if we need to. But this is the function that will be created, and then we can provide it some other callbacks on success, on error, on success. For example, we just want to show toast to the user. We don't have toasts configured. Let's just console log task creator, right? So on success, on error, on settled, unsettled, just do something like task creator. And these functions are not available on use query. They used to be available earlier, but then that led to some bugs when in how the users were using those patterns, uh, and so they have now removed this. Uh, and how the use query works is that it is declarative API. It's called declarative. Declarative how? Because we are not like triggering this fetch manually. This is being triggered programmatically. When this page component renders, the network request automatically triggers. But for mutations, we don't want that. Whenever this page loads, uh, we don't want to create a new task, right? We only want to create the task when user fills in the form. Okay, there's some problem with the AI. So what I'm saying is that we only want to create the task when the user fills in the form and they click on the submit button, right? Is submitting is going to be is pending. Okay. Oh, very good. And that's why this use mutation returns us this mutate function, right? Which we can call to like actually start our mutation, right? So inside this form, we have a handle submit function. Let's define that handle submit, right? And then where is the create task coming from? Okay. So when we select a goal and then select a title, description, we create this task, right? So this is going to be a post request 201 created, right? task was created, right? But we have, and basically, we successfully created a task, right? So we have created another task, this, right? But this is not showing in our tasks list. And why is that? Because this tasks list is cached, right? And we are not updating this cache, right? We are saying, like, we are not telling React Query how to update this. And we can do that by calling on mutation, on mutate, actually on success. So we should say whenever the success, uh, whenever this task creation succeeds, just we need query client for this. Const query client is equal to use query client, and then we just need to say query client dot invalidate queries, right? We are saying invalidate the queries of this task, which is basically remove this from the cache. Does this make sense, guys? Or is it too hard to understand? So now when we create a task, let's say learn React query, let's give it a very big title so we can identify it immediately. Let's now create this task. Now this task is being created, right? This is an 201 network request. Now automatically it has refetched the tasks, right? So if I new task, right? So this is task being created. Now automatically it is refetching the tasks and updating the UI because we call this invalidate queries. Does this make sense, guys? Yes, enabled is, that's why enabled is basically a way to telling React query to tell React query, hey, don't execute this request until enabled is false. And when enabled is true, then only then you should make this request. And it is like used in the scenarios, one of the scenarios that I showed you earlier, where because we needed data from first network request in the second network request as argument, right? So we can't, we should, we shouldn't start the second network request until we have data from the first one. That's why we use the enable flag there. Okay. And now one more thing that I want to show you guys is optimistic updates. And optimistic basically again a performance hack to give users the illusion of uh, like performance an illusion of speed, even though in the backend we are waiting for the network request to create the task. Let's say this is a new task 3. Let's say we create this, now it is creating and user is waiting, and then it is finally created and updated here, and then probably we show a message to the user or toast. And let's go to the mutations page now. This is again using our that old custom effects. So when now the user can actually mark a task as completed. When he completes a task, the user has to wait for this status to be updated, right? User has to wait a long time for it to be updated, right? So let's actually go to this page, and we know what's going to happen. We know we have a task, right? We have a task and this is going to be marked as completed. The completed property is false initially, right? From these tasks, you see completed property is false, and then it's just going to turn to true, right? It's going to return to true. So we know the logic that we need to have, but we need to wait for the network request to complete to mark this as complete on the UI, which is like user has to wait. But we can handle this through optimistic updates. We could just mark the task complete on the front end, right? When we make the network request, we mark the task as complete. And then once the network request succeeds, we can just refresh the data. So let's actually see the mutation page, right? Let's quickly update it to use, use, let's use this mutation page to use the query. Yeah. Yes, you are right. Actually, RTK query and React query kind of solve very similar problems. They are, you could say like Zustand and Redux are basically, they solve the similar problem of client state management. RTK query and Redux query solve this problem of ASIC state. And yeah, and RTK query is basically, before RTK query, people were like, we would use, if you guys have used Redux toolkit, they were like, we would use asynchronous thunks, and then we would, whatever data is fetched from the backend, we would store that in our Redux slice, and then we would have complex loading states, and then we would be managing all of that flow, right, in the Redux. But that's not a good experience, and that leads to some problems, uh, like complex code that we shouldn't be managing, like trying to keep states in sync, right? And that's when RTK query came in. RTK query, which is basically Redux Toolkit query, they said we would abstract away all of this logic of creating async thunks, updating the uh, state in the Redux store. You should not be doing that manually. We would do that for you, right? So kind of and they, for cache, they would use a store, right? So they are doing similar things, but I think React Query has some other benefits. Yes, Ahmed, that's what we are coming to. We are, so I have asked the AI to quickly update this page to use React Query, right? So now we are here. Now we are using React Query, and then this is a create mutation, update mutation, right? So let's actually see, update button on click will complete, and on handle toggle complete we say update mutation dot mutate. Is this, is this like something that we already did, right? And then this update mutation is basically whatever is run from use mutation, right? Earlier we just destructured it and we like use the mutate object directly here, but now we are just keeping all of the object returned, and then and then like accessing the mutate property here. So we are a little bit over time. Just give me 5 more minutes, guys, and then we'll just end this session. So please just don't need to see, you don't need to worry about all of this code. This is the code that we need to worry about, and then we are not worried about do mutations. We are not worried about create mutation, right? We are only worried about the update mutation. Okay, so let's try to mark this as not completed task, right? Again, undo, right? It is in progress. So let's actually do one more thing. Let's show a spinner, loading spinner next to task when it progress. When Let's show a loading spinner to next to the task when the task update mutation is in progress. Just so we know that on the UI we know that network request is in progress. And now we will quickly update this code. Optimistic up, the network request fails. We basically. Okay. I'm just waiting for it to add the loading spinner. All right. Thanks. Thanks. Helpful AI. I'm not seeing any. Yeah. So now when a task is updating, we see a loading spinner next to it. Okay. When this is updating, we see a loading spinner. When we are undo, we see a loading spinner next. So since the logic is very simple, let's see how we can actually do the optimistic updates using React Query. So we don't need all of this. Okay, we are only worried about this. We don't need handle mutate. We are only worried about update mutation. So how do you guys think we can add optimistic update since we already have this data on the front end, right? How do you think we need to do this? Anyone? Okay. So what we need to do is actually we need to manually update our cache, right? We need to manually update our cache and update that specific task status to completed on the front end. And using React Query, we can do that very easily. React Query does not differentiate between the data that is returned from query function or if we set the data manually for a specific key, right? So in this update mutation, we will call the on mutate function. This is whatever function that we give to it, that would be called whenever this mutation starts, uh, whenever this function's execution starts, React Query will call this on mutate function for us to do whatever we want to do, right? And inside this, it will pass whatever arguments were passed to the mutation function. React Query will pass these arguments directly, right? Here, we need to update the cache. Okay, so let's get the previous data const previous uh previous tasks is going to be, so we can access the query client from this use query client. We get the query client. So from this use query client, we got the query client, and then this query client gives us a get query data method in which we can specify the query key. So we are saying whatever data is related to this tasks cache in the query key, give me that. This will give me a list of previous tasks. Let's actually render that. Console.log previous tasks are these, right? So let's start a mutation and then let's also see the console. Let's mark this as complete. Okay, come on. Let's mark this as complete, right? So you see, I can see this is what is stored in the next React Query cache against my query key of tasks, right? So this is what is stored, and I just need to update this, right? So I need to go over this list, right, and update the task with this ID, right? This is the task that we are updating. Okay, const let's next tasks is going to be previous. We just map over the tasks and we say, okay, if the task that ID matches our ID of the ID that we are modifying, right? Append, just like combine the old data from that task with the new data, right? And if I actually show what's in the data, console.log uh, data, right? So this is complete. So data is basically, we are just giving it one property completed to true. We are patching our endpoint, right? So we are saying, okay, if we are updating task with this ID, right? Here we are comparing the IDs, and we are saying when the IDs match, just first like create an object with all the data that this task has, all of this data, and then just like destructure this data object and combine that, right? This is destructuring syntax which is used to destructure the objects, right? So what it's actually going to do is it's going to say first it's going to, let me show it to you guys. So first it's going to create the same task object that we had earlier, right? Why is this? So copy object. Okay. So first it's going to create this object, right? And then it's going to take the second object, which is basically this we are saying completed to we completed is false here, right? So and we will be toggling completed. We are saying mark completed to false, right? And then it will combine these two objects, and then this, since only these completed property differs, it will set this to false and then update. So this is what we are doing in this step. Is this clear, guys? Let me know if it's confusing. Okay. And then we will manually set the cache data. We'll say query client that set query data. We are saying manually set this task data to next task. Okay. Let's actually set this to an empty array just to see what happens. Okay. So now in here we are manually setting the data of this query to an empty list. So whenever we call this mutation, this function will be called. Like, let's undo it. You see, we started the network request. This function called and it updated the data of tasks key to empty list in the cache, right? And so on the front end, the data went away. So on the front end, the data went away, right? But now when the task will complete, it will refetch the tasks and then it will show the updated data, right? So, but we actually don't want to set it to empty. We want to set it to next tasks, right? And now you will see the beautiful thing called optimistic updates, right? Okay, let's reload our page once. We have fetched the tasks and goals. Let's mark this as complete. You see, the network request is still pending. We have marked this as completed already. The UI updated already. Let's undo it. Why can't I undo this? But let's try to mark this as complete. You see, the UI is already completed, and then this is updating, right? So isn't this like much better? We are optimistically updated the UI to match our state. Yes, they don't crash on the short way. Undo is available, that's why. Yes. Okay, so undo is disabled because we have some condition in here that I created and I did not read. But then you say, what happens if there is error? Ooh. Let's say right now we are invalidating on a success, but let's say we did not do that, right? And then we undo this. So now this is pending and the request completes. Now the state has turned to pending, right? But what if there was, and we undo this, initial ultimate, like automatically changes to pending, right? The state has updated. We mark it as complete. It is optimistically updated to complete. But let's actually throw an error in here. Let's say this mutation function dot update. Let's say it has an error from the backend, not implemented, right? Now let's again refresh. Let's undo this, right? And now we got the error, but the our UI is updated to like updated the state because in here uh, on muted we manually changed our cache, right? So let's try this again. Try to mark this as complete, right? So there is an error from the backend is throwing an error, right? But we are marking it is complete on the UI. So this is not something that should be possible, right? And so this is a case we need to do. This is a case one of the students asked is how do we invalidate this? What happens if we optimistically update the UI and there is an error from the backend? In that case, we can return the previous tasks that we had, the previous state. We can return that from here, return previous tasks, and on error method. So this again on error method is provided from React Query, right? it takes the it and these following variables, they are like following arguments, they are automatically provided by React Query. As the first argument, React Query gives the error object itself. As the second argument, React Query gives the variables, which is basically whatever is passed to this mutation function, right? And as the third variable is the context, that's going to be whatever we return from this mutate, right? Let's say we returned hello world. Let's say we returned a string hello world, right? Now if we console.log context, okay, now there's going to be an error. So if we console log context now, you see it's console logging hello world. So this context is whatever we returned from on mutate function. And this is very helpful for us because we return the previous data from there, right? Previous tasks in the context. And then we are saying, again, we are updating the data manually, but we are setting it to whatever the previous tasks were, whatever the state was before we like updated this, right? So this was data that was fetched from the backend. This was the state, right? And then we are resetting it to that. So now let's refresh the page. When we undo this, you see, let's actually wait for a few seconds for the API. Okay, let's response it. Okay, let's wait, right? Let's wait for 3 seconds. Let's refresh the page. Okay, let's undo this. So now it is already updated pending, but network request is in progress. And that, and we need to actually also throw an error. Where is the if response already? Let's say we are just throwing an error, whatever. So again, let's try this one more time. We mark this as complete. It automatically updates the UI, but the network request. So we throwed an error from the API function, right? So it automatically reverted the change, right? In case of an error, we automatically reverted a change. Let's try this again. Mark this as complete. The UI updates to complete, right? But in case of error, it automatically reverts the change. Is this clear, guys? So this is how optimistic updates work. And that's basically that's basically all that like I wanted to discuss. If you have any questions, you can ask.
तो जहर भी इसमें ये जो ओन एरर का हमने कॉल बैक फंक्शन बनाया है, ये इसलिए बनाया कि हमने जब फॉर एग्जांपल जो एपी से रिस्पॉन्स हमें फेल आता है, एक
हम्म,
दफ़ा हम कंप्लीट शो करवा देते हैं, लेकिन हम फिर जो डाटा रिवर्ट करवाते हैं वो तो फिर हमें एपी से रिस्पॉन्स आ रहा होता है ना, और उसके बाद हमने उस एपी को रिस्पॉन्स को हम कंप्लीटेड से पेंडिंग या फेल के केस में शो करवा देते हैं। तो
हम्म,
वो चीज़ जो है वो चीज़ हैंडल कर रही है ऑन एरर का कॉल बैक फंक्शन। इसमें
हम्म।
हम क्या करते हैं, कॉन्टेक्स्ट प्रोवाइड करते हैं, उस कॉन्टेक्स्ट के अंदर हम और ऊपर वाला फंक्शन ऑन म्यूटेट के अंदर हम चेक करते हैं प्रीवियस टास्क कौन सा था। प्रीवियस टास्क डॉट मैप करके हमने दफ़ा कंसोल आके चेक किया था, उसमें सारे प्रीवियस टास्क आ रहे थे।
यस।
ठीक है, उसके बाद हम फिर ये चेक करते हैं कि अगर तो एपी के रिस्पॉन्स में एरर है तो वो एरर में चला जाएगा, अगर तो वो सक्सेस है तो फिर ऑन म्यूटेट वाला कॉल बैक फंक्शन चल के वो रिटर्न कर देगा पूरे प्रीवियस फंक्शन।
हम्म।
ठीक है, बेहतरीन हो गया।
Yeah.
ठीक है, ओके सर, बेहतरीन।
And again, इससे on mutate से we can return anything and that will be passed as a third argument to on error, right? For example, हम यहाँ पे const let's say revert changes, हम एक function बना लेते हैं। वो क्या करेगा, query client dot set query data uh, dot set sorry set query data, right? वो फिर tasks वाले, सो एक फंक्शन हमने बनाया है
हम्म।
रिवर्ट चेंजेस, जो क्या कर रहा है उस क्यूरी डाटा को वही प्रीवियस डाटा पे सेट कर रहा है, राइट?
यस।
बस हमने इसको अभी कॉल नहीं किया, राइट? हमने इसको बस बनाया है।
ठीक है,
और फिर
ठीक है।
हम क्या करते हैं,
हम्म।
यहाँ से हम वो फंक्शन एज इस ऑब्जेक्ट में भेज देते हैं रिवर्ट चेंजेस, राइट? ठीक है। और फिर ये कॉन्टेक्स्ट में जो भी आया है हम उसको वो वाला फंक्शन हम कॉल कर देंगे इसमें। वो ये ऑब्जेक्ट है, राइट? तो
हम्म।
ये इसमें फिर हम रिवर्ट चेंजेस आएगा, फिर हम उस फंक्शन को कॉल कर देंगे।
ओके 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 ओके। ठीक है, हमें कस्टम फंक्शन बना के भी उसमें रिवर्ट चेंजेस
हाँ,
हम प्रीवियस
कुछ,
टास्क में अगर। हम्म।
हाँ कुछ भी तरीके से हमने करना, और हम इससे ऑब्जेक्ट ना भी रिटर्न करना चाहें, राइट? और रिटर्न
ठीक।
चेंज, राइट?
ऑलराइट, बेहतरीन।
और
है।
अब ये कॉन्टेक्स्ट बेसिकली क्या है, ये तो थर्ड आर्ग्यूमेंट है ना। और हम इस फंक्शन में इसको कुछ भी नाम दे सकते हैं, इसको कॉन्टेक्स्ट दे सकते हैं। हम ये कह देते हैं अगर कॉन्टेक्स्ट है तो उसको कॉल कर दो, राइट?
यस राइट। कॉन्टेक्स्ट है उसको कॉल कर दो, लेकिन
हाँ,
मेन चीज एरर और वेरिएबल्स है मेरे ख्याल से।
हाँ।
वेरिएबल्स के पता, उससे टेंस को वेरिएबल से पता लगेगा कि एरर आ रहा है या रिस्पॉन्स ट्रू आ रहा है। तो एक
नहीं,
दफा था। हम्म।
वेरिएबल्स इज बेसिकली वट एवर इज पास टू दिस अपडेट म्यूटेशन फंक्शन, राइट? अब वो हमारे लिए यूजफुल हो सकता है यहाँ पे। फॉर एग्जांपल, अगर हम फॉर एग्जांपल अगर हमने किसी स्पेसिफिक आईडी वाली टास्क, सिर्फ उसी आईडी को क्यूरी डाटा करना होता है, राइट?
हम्म।
तो हम यहाँ पे फिर वो वेरिएबल्स में से आईडी यूज करते हैं, लाइक वेरिएबल्स डॉट आईडी करके। और फिर इसको हम कुछ भी नाम दे सकते हैं, ये तो बस हम अपने फंक्शन में इसको कुछ भी कह सकते हैं। इसको हम इधर डिस्ट्रक्चर भी कर सकते हैं आईडी, और जो भी उसको पास हुआ है वो भी कर सकते हैं, ठीक है?
ठीक है ठीक है ठीक है।
हाँ।
फिर
और
असल चीज ऑन म्यूटेट का फंक्शन, जिसमें हमने एक, या तो हम प्रीवियस टास्क को भी पास कर सकते हैं और इसमें एक अपना कस्टम फंक्शन लिखे वहां से भी फिल्टर आउट कर सकते हैं कि हमें डाटा क्या आ रहा है। तो अगर तो
हम्म,
हमें प्रीवियस टास्क मिल रहे होंगे तो हम रिवर्ट चेंजेस करके एक दफा कंप्लीटेड शो करेंगे। अदरवाइज
हाँ,
फिर हम देखेंगे कि उधर से रिस्पॉन्स बैकएंड से आया है तो ठीक है, अदरवाइज हम ये चीज फिर ऑन म्यूटेट वाला फंक्शन मेन चीज हो जाएगी।
यस, यस।
ठीक है ठीक है
ये
ठीक।
ऑन
अच्छा,
म्यूटेट
एक
नहीं।
चीज, एक क्वेश्चन रह गया बस। अभी आपने पहले रिवर्ट चेंजेस से पहले जब आपने कस्टम नहीं बनाया था ना, आपने प्रीवियस टास्क को कंसोल कर किया था और कंसोल में सारे टास्क आ रहे थे, फिर आपने रिटर्न किया। तो एक तो
हम्म,
वो अप्रोच थी कि प्रीवियस टास्क से पता लग जाएगा कि उसके कितने टास्क आ रहे हैं, कौन सा अपडेट हुआ है, अगर और उसकी आईडी की बेस पे अपडेट हो जाएगा। हम इसमें अपना, आप रिवर्ट चेंजेस को भी यूज कर सकते हैं, उसको भी रिटर्न करवा सकते हैं कि उसमें क्या चेंज आया है। उस आईडी की बेस के स्पेसिफिक टास्क जो अपडेट होगा, उधर से हम देख लेंगे कौन के एपीए से रिस्पॉन्स क्यों हम डिफरेंशिएट फिर। ठीक है, ऑप्टिमिस्टिक अपडेट में फिर ये है कि हमें जो कंप्लीटेड स्टेटस लिखा था वो हम खुद से देंगे कि यार ये मे बी
हाँ,
इस ये कंप्लीट हो जाएगा वो स्टैटिक्स जो होगा। लेकिन जो ही
यस।
हमें एपीएस रिस्पॉन्स आ गया वो ऑटोमेटिकली रिवर्ट हो जाता है अकॉर्डिंग टू दी प्रीवियस टास्क, देखता है कि अपडेट क्या चीज़ है, और जब रिस्पॉन्स आ जाता है तो रिटर्न, जो अब रिटर्न में क्या आ जाएगा, या तो सक्सेस में जाएगा ऑन मुटेट के, या ऑन एरर में चला जाएगा। ठीक है।
हम्म।
ठीक, बेहतरीन बेहतरीन।
तो हम बेसिकली कर क्या रहे हैं, समझे?
हम्म।
ये गेट क्यूरी डेटा फंक्शन कर रहे हैं, सेट क्यूरी डेटा कर रहे हैं, राइट?
ये
मेनली ये
राइट।
दो चीज़ कर रहे हैं। हम
हम्म।
बेसिकली कर क्या कर रहे हैं, जो रिएक्ट क्यूरी ने अपनी कैशे बनाई हुई है ना, उसने एक ऑब्जेक्ट बनाया होगा बेसिकली, राइट? ऑब्जेक्ट होगा, उसमें कीज होंगी, और जो कीज हमारी टास्क है, राइट? और उसके अगेंस्ट
हम्म।
उसने एक लिस्ट रखी हुई है। तो हम उसको कर क्या रहे हैं, हम उसको मैनुअली मैनिपुलेट कर रहे हैं। और ये लाइक जावास्क्रिप्ट वाली चीज़ है, राइट? हमने
हम्म।
क्या, हमने जो भी उसने टास्क था, राइट? फॉर एग्जांपल अगर हमारी टास्क बहुत सिंपल सी चीज़ होती, लेट्स से कि हमारी टास्क सिर्फ नंबर्स की लिस्ट होती, 1 2 3, ठीक है? इस
हम्म।
तरह होती, राइट? और फिर हम क्या कर रहे होते, हम कोई इसमें से वन को हम कहते हैं डिलीट करना है हमने, सही है?
हम्म।
तो हम क्या करते हैं, हम प्रीवियस टास्क डॉट मैप करते टास्क और टास्क डॉट आईडी, मतलब उससे ना हम एक नई स्टेट बनाते।
हम्म।
इफ टास्क डॉट आई डी इज इक्वल टू आई डी, इसको एक्चुअली फिल्टर करते हैं, राइट? फिल्टर। और फिर ये बहुत सिंपल सा हो जाता है, राइट? इस तरह,
हम्म।
इज नॉट, राइट? फिल्टर का आपको
ठीक है।
कंसेप्ट पता है, राइट?
जो
सो
कंडीशन
बेसिकली,
मैच होती है तो
हाँ,
वो सिर्फ उसको डिलीट के केस में हम
हाँ।
ना डिलीट में फिल्टर आउट कर देते
अगर
हैं।
हमारा 1 2 3 होता और हमारी आईडी 1 होती, तो ये वाला क्या करता, ये हमें सिर्फ वन, वन वन छोड़ देता, 2 और 3 दे देता, राइट?
राइट राइट।
और फिर हम क्या कह रहे हैं, हम रिएक्ट क्यूरी को कह रहे हैं यार इसके अगेंस्ट ना, अ-
हम्म।
अब ये प्रीवियस टास्क में क्या पड़ा होगा, उसमें वही जो पहले था 1 2 3 पड़ा है, ठीक है?
ऐसे ही है।
और फिर हमने एक नेक्स्ट टास्क बनाया, उसमें 2 3 पड़ा है, फिर हमने उसको कह दिया कि यार ये टास्क को अपडेट करके इसको ना ये कर दो,
हम्म,
तो उसने क्या किया, जो भी लिस्ट थी उसको ये कर दिया, अपडेट कर दिया, जो भी हमने उसको प्रोवाइड किया, ठीक है?
ठीक है ठीक है ठीक है।
और फिर हमने ये प्रीवियस टास्क जो था वो इस फंक्शन से रिटर्न किया अपने
हम्म।
के लिए, ताकि और फिर रिएक्ट क्यूरी ने हमें ये हेल्प की, उसने कहा कि यार जो जो तुम जो भी इससे रिटर्न करोगे ना, वो ऑन एरर के थर्ड आर्ग्यूमेंट में मैं दे दूंगा तुम्हें, ठीक है? इससे हम कुछ भी
ठीक है
रिटर्न करें वो थर्ड आर्ग्यूमेंट। तो हमने इससे क्या रिटर्न किया, हमने इससे वो प्रीवियस टास्क का एक ऑब्जेक्ट रिटर्न किया, राइट।
हम्म।
अब इससे इससे हमने क्या रिटर्न किया, हमने इस तरह कुछ रिटर्न किया प्रीवियस टास्क, और फिर उसमें वो लिस्ट थी 1 2 3 वाली, राइट।
राइट।
और फिर अगेन यहाँ पे हमने उसको मैनिपुलेट करके हमने सिंपल ये कह दिया टास्क को 1 2 3 कर दो, इंस्टेड ऑफ जो भी पड़ी है इसको ओवरराइट करके ये कर दो। अब समझ आइए।
ठीक है। बेहतरीन।
हम्म।
सही है।
और
ठीक है।
और इससे बहुत ब्यूटीफुल चीज़ें हो सकती हैं। एक्चुअली लेट मी शो यू गाइस। और फिर इसका एक ना, एक चीज़ जो होती है वो ये होती है, एक्चुअली लेट मी शो इट टू यू फ्रॉम द कोड। फॉर एग्जाम्पल अब ये टाइम मास्टर्स का एक रेपो है जिस पे मैं काम कर रहा था, हम इसमें एक बना रहे हैं टाइम मास्टर, टाइम मैनेजमेंट के लिए एप्लीकेशन, राइट।
ठीक है।
लेट मी npm run dev, let me run this actually, then npm run dev. Sorry, my laptop's battery died and it shut down. तो आप ही पूछ रहे थे ना क्वेश्चन, अहमद
जी जी।
का।
वही मैंने कहा अभी रिकॉर्डिंग चल रही
लेट
है,
मी
आई थिंक
शेयर
सो,
द
लीव।
स्क्रीन अगेन।
ओके।
थैंक यू फॉर स्टेइंग बैक। तो अब यहाँ पे ना बेसिकली हमारे पास स्केड्यूल का पेज है, राइट। और यहाँ पे मैं क्या कर सकता हूँ, स्केड्यूल को ना ड्रॉप ड्रैग एंड ड्रॉप कर सकता हूँ किसी भी टाइम पे, ओके।
ठीक है।
ये अब ये क्या कर रहा है, इट इज मेकिंग अ बैक एंड नेटवर्क रिक्वेस्ट, राइट। आई शो इट यू। सो व्हेनेवर आई अपडेट दिस पेज, इट इज मेकिंग अ बैक एंड नेटवर्क रिक्वेस्ट, ठीक है। अब इसमें ये इतना फास्ट इसलिए क्योंकि इसमें मैं अभी ये लोकल डीबी यूज़ कर रहा हूँ, तो वो
हम्म।
ऑब्वियसली दैट्स वेरी फास्ट।
जी, अब ड्रैग एंड ड्रॉप कर रहे हैं तो ओपी कॉल हो रही है, हाँ। हम्म।
बट लेट मी एक्चुअली
जरा समराइज करते हैं जरा एक दफा उस डॉक्यूमेंट में आपकी मेन बात, मैं एक्स नहीं पॉइंट गेट कर पाया।
हाँ, एक मिनट, वेट, प्रॉमिस,
यूज म्यूटेशन की selected query,
सॉल्व, यार क्या सिंटेक्स है, वेट फॉर 10 सेकेंड। सो अब देखें, अब मैं इसको अपडेट करता हूँ, ठीक है।
हम्म।
अभी अब ये लोड इंडिकेटर दिखा रहा है, अब मेरी नेटवर्क रिक्वेस्ट, क्योंकि मैंने उसको अभी ब्लॉक कर दिया एपीआई को, लाइक 10 सेकेंड्स बाद ये नेटवर्क रिक्वेस्ट आएगी, राइट।
राइट, प्रॉमिस
हाँ,
रखी हमने।
हाँ, बट अब क्या ये ऑप्टिमिस्टिकली, लाइक उसने यूआई मुझे अपडेट कर दिया और ये बस एक लोडिंग इंडिकेटर हमने यहाँ पे दिखा दिया कि यार अभी ना नेटवर्क रिक्वेस्ट भी इन प्रोग्रेस है, बट आई एम नॉट ब्लॉक्ड। मैं मल्टीपल चीज़ें अपडेट कर सकता हूँ और ये मल्टीपल चीज़ें साइमल्टेनियसली अपडेट हो रही होंगी, ठीक है।
ओके 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 ओके। यूजर को
और
दिखाने के
इसका,
लिए लोडर रखा हुआ है,
हाँ,
लेकिन ठीक है।
ये लोडर ना भी होता, लाइक अगर लोडर हम ना डालें तो आपको तो नहीं पता ना कि नहीं हुआ, आपको तो
हम्म।
अपडेट किया, अपडेट हो गया, राइट।
राइट।
और फिर ये भी उसी तरह सेम सेम ऑन म्यूटेट फंक्शन में हम क्या करें, क्यूरी की, उस कैजुअल क्यूरीज की वीकली डॉट क्यूरी की, ठीक है,
हम्म।
क्लाइंट।
कि
और ये हम कह रहे हैं अगर कोई भी पहले क्यूरीज इन प्रोग्रेस हैं, फैचिंग फैचिंग जारी है, तो उसको कैंसिल कर दो, राइट।
राइट,
इसका,
ये कैंसिल वाला हमने कॉन्सेप्ट आई थिंक सो
हाँ,
कैंसिल
नहीं,
क्यूरीज नहीं पढ़ा। हम्म।
तो अब ये बेसिकली इस तरह है कि अगर मैं अपनी डाटा को, लेट्स से मैं कहता हूँ ऑन सक्सेस, तुम क्या करो, एक बल्कि ना, इसको हम बहुत इजीली बता देते, मैं कहता हूँ एक नेटवर्क रिक्वेस्ट इन प्रोग्रेस थी जो जो क्यूरीज फैच कर रही थी, ठीक है।
हम्म।
फिर आपने क्या किया, आपने उसको ऑप्टिमिस्टिकली अपडेट कर दिया, मैंने उसको क्या कर दिया, मैंने इसका जो ये मंडे को शो हो रहा था इसको मैंने कैश में ना ट्यूसडे कर दिया ऑप्टिमिस्टिकली, राइट।
हम्म।
मगर जब वो नेटवर्क रिक्वेस्ट ने रिजल्ट किया, उसने मेरी ये चेंजेस को ओवर राइट कर दिया।
ओके ओके।
तो मेरी जो कैश वाली ऑप्टिमिस्टिक चीज़ थी वो तो चली गई। इसलिए हम ये करते हैं यहाँ पे कैंसिल क्यूरीज, कि यार अगर कोई नेटवर्क रिक्वेस्ट आके हमारा जो ऑप्टिमिस्टिक चीज़ है उसको ना इनवैलिडेट ना कर दे, उसको ओवर राइट,
हम्म। ठीक
ठीक है।
है।
फिर अगेन हमने यहाँ पे वो प्रीवियस लिया, ठीक है, प्रीवियस जो भी इस क्यूरी का पहले से डाटा है, क्यूरी की
हम्म।
अगेंस्ट जो भी, और फिर एक रोल बैक फंक्शन बनाया है कि जो इस क्यूरी के डाटा के अगेंस्ट प्रीवियस कर देगा, ठीक है। और
ठीक है।
फिर लेट्स इग्नोर दिस, और ये वाला सारा फिर वो यू कैन से क्या
रोल बैक कब होता
है।
है? रोल बैक मतलब फॉर एग्जांपल अभी हमने जो कैंसिल क्यूरीज की हैं, वो
हम्म,
किस केस में चलेगा? कैंसिल क्यूरीज फॉर एग्जांपल अगर मैं एक ड्रैग एंड ड्रॉप करता हूँ, ठीक है, मैं यूजर को मंडे से ट्यूसडे शो कर देता हूँ और एपीआई कॉल से रिस्पॉन्स थोड़ा लेट आता है। अब मैंने तो यूजर को शो कर दिया। अब
हम्म,
एपी कॉल हमने पहले भी सेशन से पहले ये पढ़ा था, आपने कहा था कि एपी को कॉल जब फेल होती है ना, तो फिर हमने वो एरर वाला एरर की हुक और ऑन मोटेट के अंदर एक फंक्शन बना के उसको हैंडल किया था।
यस,
ठीक है। ठीक है। अब इसमें जो है वो कैंसिल क्यूरीज कब चलेगी, मतलब उसको
हाँ,
कैंसिल क्यूरी वाला केस कब चलेगा, किस एज
हाँ,
केस में चलेगा वाला?
बता दो
कि
मैं
उससे कैसे पता लगेगा कि मैंने इस क्यूरी को कैंसिल कर देना है, क्योंकि अभी डाटा ये कैंसिल। जी।
हम्म। अच्छा, ये वाला जो लॉजिक है ना, ये फिर अगेन वो कॉम्प्लेक्स ऑब्जेक्ट को अपडेट कर रहा है, जो मैंने आपको बताया ना कि अब अगर ये वाली वन 1 2 3 थी, ठीक है, तो उसको हमने नया नई शेप दी, राइट। तो ये भी अगेन फिर वही कर रहा है कि एग्जिस्टिंग में से वो
की इसकी बेस पे।
ब्लॉक लेता है,
ऑब्जेक्ट।
फिर उस ब्लॉक को, डाटा को मर्ज करके न्यू डाटा के साथ मर्ज करता है, ठीक है।
ठीक है।
और फिर उसका डे अपडेट कर देता है अगर वो अपडेट होने वाला है,
ठीक
और
है
फिर
ठीक, कीज की बेस पे मंडे ट्यूजडे उसकी कीज की बेस पे ऑब्जेक्ट की कीज की बेस के ऊपर, हाँ,
तो
लूप
ये
लग
वाला
जाता
हमारा बिजनेस लॉजिक, अगर हम इसको
है। ये
इग्नोर
अलग
करें
चीज़ है, हाँ हाँ, ये
तो
हमारा
रिलेटेड
बिजनेस
है,
लॉजिक।
right?
ठीक है।
हम बेसिकली नेक्स्ट ले रहे हैं और फिर क्यूरी क्लाइंट डॉट सेट क्यूरी डाटा कॉल कर रहे हैं, जो कि हमारा नेक्स्ट डेटा, राइट।
राइट।
ये हमारा मेन क्यूरी से रिलेटेड लॉजिक। अब ये
ठीक है।
कैंसिल क्यूरीज,
हम्म।
इसको हमने एक क्यूरी की दी है, हमने कहा है अगर ये वाली क्यूरी इन प्रोग्रेस है,
हम्म।
तो मैं इसको कह देता हूँ कि अगर क्यूरी की इस क्यूरी की इस, ये हमारा क्या है, स्केजुअल है, स्केजुअल्स।
स्केजुअल्स।
हाँ,
हम्म।
स्केजुअल का कुछ डाटा फेच हो रहा है ना बैकएंड से, तो उसको
हम्म।
कैंसिल कर दो भाई, अभी कैंसिल कर दो। इसकी वजह अगेन ये वाली है, ठीक है।
हम्म।
बैकएंड पे पड़ा है 1 2 3, सही है।
ठीक है।
हमने उसको कर दिया 1 2, ठीक है।
हम्म।
अगर हमने बैकएंड से दोबारा डाटा फैच कर लिया है, अब लेट्स से एक हमारी नेटवर्क रिक्वेस्ट थी, वन नेटवर्क रिक्वेस्ट इज fetch data, right? And then two network request is update, ठीक है।
ठीक है।
और अब एक ऐसा केस हो गया कि जब हमने ये अपडेट और ऑन म्यूटेट कॉल की, हमारी इनवैलिडेट हुई थी, या कैश हमारी स्टेल थी, या कुछ भी था, उसकी वजह से ना ये फैच वाली जो नेटवर्क रिक्वेस्ट थी ना, ये पहले से प्रोग्रेस में थी,
ठीक है।
ठीक है।
हम्म।
अब हमारे पास, फिर हमने अपडेट वाली नेटवर्क रिक्वेस्ट कर, अब हमारे पास ये दो नेटवर्क रिक्वेस्ट इन प्रोग्रेस हो गई, सही है।
ठीक है।
और फिर हमने अपनी कैश को मैनुअली 1 2 3 को 1 2 कर दिया, सही है।
सही है।
अब ये वाली ना एक रेस कंडीशन है। इसमें हमें नहीं पता कि पहले इसका रिजल्ट आएगा या पहले इसका रिजल्ट आएगा बैकएंड से, राइट। हो
हम्म।
सकता है कि ये 10 सेकंड ले ले और ये 5 सेकंड में हो जाए, राइट।
हाँ, रेस कंडीशन में आ गई इसमें।
तो
हम्म।
हमें नहीं पता। अब इसमें ऐसा हो सकता है कि मैंने जो इसको 1 2 3 किया है, 1 2 किया है, राइट। ये फैच डेटा इस नेटवर्क रिक्वेस्ट के अपडेट वाली से पहले हो जाए, और वो फिर बैकएंड उसको 1 2 3 दे देगा, राइट।
राइट।
बैकएंड पे तो 1 2 3 पड़ा, अभी बैकएंड ने अपडेट नहीं किया अपने पास ये डाटा कि 3 नहीं है मेरे
हम्म।
पास। तो वो फिर
हम्म।
इसको ओवरराइड करके 1 2 3 कर देगा, और यूजर कहेगा ये क्या हो गया, ये तो
हम्म।
मैंने डिलीट कर दिया, वापस कैसे आ गया, राइट। तो ये
ठीक
कैंसिल
है।
क्यूरी क्या करता है, ये कहता है अगर कोई नेटवर्क रिक्वेस्ट इस क्यूरी को फेच करने के लिए प्रोग्रेस में है, उसको
हम्म।
खत्म कर दो, वो हमें नहीं चाहिए।
ठीक है। ठीक, क्लीन अप वाला सीन है ये।
हाँ, वो
अगर तो
उसको
प्रोग्रेस
खत्म
में
कर
हो तो।
दो।
ठीक है।
अगर पहले से डाटा फेच हो रहा है उसको रहने दो, क्योंकि मैं मैन्युअली अपडेट कर रहा हूँ। और फिर जब ऑन सेटल्ड होगा, मतलब मेरा एरर आ गई है, सक्सेस आ गई है, तो मैं फिर उस डाटा को मैनुअली इनवैलिडेट कर रहा हूँ ताकि वो दोबारा से रीफेच कर ले।
बेहतरीन बेहतरीन।
ठीक है।
बेहतरीन हो गया सर।
और फिर यहाँ पे कुछ, अगेन यहाँ से हम प्रीवियस डाटा भी रिटर्न कर सकते थे, रोल बैक भी कुछ भी कर सकते थे, राइट। और इसको हम
राइट।
कॉन्टेक्स्ट कर सकते थे। तो
ठीक,
बस
आपने भी वही वही सीन यूज़ किया होगा ऑन एरर के ऊपर वेरिएबल्स रो जो हमें बता रहे थे। ठीक, ऑन म्यूटेट के अंदर बिजनेस लॉजिक आ गई कि प्रीवियस। आपने वैसे वो रोल बैक फंक्शन जिस तरह हमें बताया था ना, वो भी यूज़ किया हुआ है। जिस तरह आप बता रहे थे कि आप फिल्टर डाटा का वो एक अपना कस्टम बना के ना, जिसमें फॉर एग्जांपल लिस्ट आ रही है प्रीवियस टू टास्क की, उसमें अपना
हम्म,
कस्टम फंक्शन ही बना के उसको भी रिटर्न करवा सकते हैं, जैसे आपने करवाया हुआ रिटर्न रोल बैक में।
हाँ हाँ, दिस इज समथिंग दैट आई वांटेड टू डिस्कस बट टाइम नहीं मिला। तो अब उस, जो हम पहले, हमने ये कोड वाला किया ना, ये वाला, राइट। अब इसमें देखें हमारे पास क्या था। हमारे पास टास्क का पेज था, यहाँ पे हमें गोल्स गोल्स चाहिए थे, राइट, ये वाले।
जी जी, यही यूज़
और
क्वेरी के
फिर
अंदर गोल। हम्म।
हमारे पास गोल्स का पेज था, उसके ऊपर भी हमें ये वाली यूज क्यूरी चाहिए थी। तो हम, ये बेसिकली ना डुप्लीकेटेड लॉजिक है, ठीक है।
हम्म।
और फिर फॉर एग्जांपल अगर हमारा गोल्स का म्यूटेशन वाला पेज होता तो हमें उसमें ये यूज यूज इनवैलिडेट करनी होती ना, इनवैलिडेट क्यूरी। फिर उसको हमने ये क्यूरी की देनी होती, राइट।
हाँ, गेट करने के लिए गेट की भी दोबारा कॉल हो जाए
हाँ।
फ्रेश डाटा के लिए।
तो अब ये वाली चीज़ ना डुप्लीकेट हो रही है मल्टीपल जगह पे, तो उसके लिए हम क्या करते हैं, हम इसका एक सेपरेट से हम लेयर बना लेते हैं। दैट लेयर हियर
हुक
इज,
बना लेते हैं।
हाँ, हुक हुक भी बना सकते हैं। अब ये देखें, अब ये स्केजुअल क्वीज का मैंने एक ऑब्जेक्ट बनाया हुआ है, राइट।
ठीक है।
इसमें मैंने सारी, एक तो कीज डिफाइन की हुई है कि एक तो रूट की है स्केजुअल, ठीक है। फिर वीकली के लिए स्केजुअल। और ये अगर इसको मैं देखूंगा, ये देखें, वीकली की क्या आएगी, स्केजुअल और फिर वीकली, राइट राइट। फिर गोल्स की क्या आएगी, स्केजुअल और गोल्स, सही है।
ओके 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 ओके।
हाँ, और म्यूटेशन की भी फिर मैंने कीज बनाई, स्केजुअल और अपडेट, स्केजुअल क्रिएट, स्केजुअल डिलीट। तो अब ये वाली जो ऑप्टिमिस्टिक
इसको यूज़
अपडेट,
कैसे करते हैं? हाँ, इसको यूज़ कैसे करते हैं जो अपने
हाँ
कस्टम अलग बनाई म्यूटेशंस की या
हाँ,
कीज़ को?
मैं बताता हूँ। और फिर ये अब,
स्केचुअल क्यूरीज।
हाँ, अब
वीकली
हम
गोल,
इसको,
ठीक।
मैं आपको बताता हूँ, ये मैं एक्सप्लेन कर देता हूँ। बट द थिंग इज कि हम अब इस की को किसी यहाँ पे यूज़ करेंगे किस तरह,
हम्म।
यूज़ कैजुअल क्यूरीज में। इसमें हम जाएंगे, अब यहाँ पे, राइट, यहाँ पे हमने ये यूज़ की हुई है, राइट। तो हमने कुछ भी नहीं करना, हमने ये वाला ऑब्जेक्ट रीड करना है। और दिस इज लाइक, ये तो जावास्क्रिप्ट है ना, ये तो ऑब्जेक्ट हमने बनाया हुआ है। हमने
हम्म।
उसमें एक हमारी की है और उसके अगेंस्ट वैल्यू पड़ी है, लिस्ट पड़ी है, राइट। सो ये
राइट।
तो सिंपल जावास्क्रिप्ट का ऑब्जेक्ट है जिसमें रूट है, रूट के आगे लिस्ट पड़ी है वीकली की है, तो इसको हमने किस तरह यूज़ करना है, हमने
डॉट
बस
डॉट सिलेक्टेड डॉट म्यूटेशन डॉट इस तरह,
तो
वीकली
हमने
डॉट इस तरह।
इसको हमने अपनी फाइल से इंपोर्ट करना है, और बस
हम्म।
को यूज़ कर लेना, म्यूटेशन डॉट अपडेट वीकली
दोनों
डॉट।
केस में हो सकता है, म्यूटेशन में भी आपने क्यूरी, क्यूरी और म्यूटेशन जो रिपीटेड यूज हो रही होंगी उसकी हम क्या बना सकते हैं, एक इस तरह की हुक बना लेते हैं और इसको एक्सपोर्ट कर लेंगे और सिलेक्टेड क्यूरी डॉट म्यूटेशन डॉट इस तरह करके यूज कर लेंगे।
हम्म।
बेहतरीन।
यस।
ठीक
और फिर
ठीक।
इसमें एक और चीज़ आ जाती है कि अब हमने चलो क्यूरी कीज तो कर ली उधर,
हम्म।
राइट।
राइट।
क्यूरी कीज तो हमने कर ली, मगर हमने फिर अब क्यूरी की वहां से आ जाएगी, ठीक है, मगर क्यूरी
यहाँ अगर यहाँ
हाँ।
पे हम वो लिखते हैं ना तो फिर हम मैनुअल स्ट्रिंग के अंदर पास करते हैं या कोई ऑब्जेक्ट की, वैसे तो कीज वैसे हमने स्ट्रिंग अभी तक हम देखेंगे कि कीज जो है टास्क हैं या कोई भी चीज़ है वो स्ट्रिंग में, ताकि वो इनवैलिडेट टैग्स नहीं जिस तरह इनवैलिडेट क्यूरीज करने के लिए देते, तो ये सारी लॉजिक हमने एक अलग फाइल में रख लिया, इसको एक्सपोर्ट किया हुआ है।
यस
ठीक है
यस।
ठीक है।
फॉर एग्जाम्पल, अब ये म्यूटेशन है, अब इसमें जिस तरह क्यूरीज में अगर हम जाएं इसकी, राइट, तो अब यूज क्यूरी में क्या होगा, एक हमें इसको क्या देना होता है, क्यूरी की।
जी।
इसको हमें एक ऑब्जेक्ट पास करना है जिसमें हमें
यस।
क्या देना, क्यूरी की। मैं कह देता हूँ वीकली डॉट क्यूरी की, ठीक है। फिर मुझे क्यूरी फंक्शन भी तो देना है। और
हम्म।
यूजली ये दोनों क्या हो रहे हैं, इकट्ठे यूज हो रहे हैं कि इस की के अगेंस्ट ये वाला फंक्शन एग्जीक्यूट होना है, राइट।
राइट।
तो फिर हम अपने ऑब्जेक्ट में क्या कर सकते हैं, वी कैन गो वन लेयर डीप, और जहाँ पे पहले हमने सिर्फ कीज डिफाइन की थी, ठीक है, और
हम्म।
ये भी कीज ही थी बेसिकली, बस लेयर्ड था कि इसको मैं इस तरह भी कर सकता था, म्यूटेशन, अपडेट, और फिर
हम्म।
म्यूटेशन क्रिएट, राइट। बट दिस वाज बेसिकली डिफाइनिंग कीज, वी कैन एक्चुअली डिफाइन बोथ कीज एंड फंक्शंस टुगेदर, ठीक है।
हम्म।
अब हमने ऊपर की डिफाइन की, फिर हमने
हम्म।
वो की यहीं पे यूज कर लिया, और ये फंक्शन भी यहीं पे डिफाइन कर लिया इस।
अच्छा 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 अच्छा, अब
ये
बिजनेस लॉजिक जो बिजनेस
हाँ
म्यूटेशन के अंदर जो फंक्शन की लॉजिक होती है वो भी आपने डिफाइन कर दी और उसको
हाँ,
म्यूटे। ओके 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 ओके।
बिकॉज कीज और फंक्शन बेसिकली स्ट्रांगली एक दूसरे से टाई करते हैं, राइट, तो
हाँ,
वो दोनों एक ही जगह पे हैं। और फिर
असल काम
जहाँ
फंक्शन का होता है, असल काम कीज का तब होता है जब आपने डाटा दोबारा गेट करना है डिलीट के बाद या अपडेट के बाद। ठीक है।
तो अब हमारे जो हमने ये कस्टम यूज वीकली स्केड्यूल वाली हुक बनाई, उसमें हमने कुछ भी नहीं किया, सिर्फ यूज क्यूरी करके वीकली को कॉल कर दिया। उस वीकली ने क्या किया, क्यूरी की और क्यूरी फंक्शन दोनों दे दिए, ठीक है। अब
ठीक है।
अगर हमें इसमें कुछ और हमें कुछ अपडेट करना होता, तो मैं इसको क्या करता, डीस्ट्रक्चर कर देता। फॉर एग्जाम्पल, मुझे
हम्म।
स्टेट टाइम अपडेट करना है, मैं यहाँ पे दे देता, मुझे प्लेस होल्डर डाटा अपडेट करना है, मैं यहाँ पे दे देता, मुझे एक जगह पे स्टेट टाइम अपडेट करना है, एक जगह पे नहीं करना, तो वो मतलब सारी चीज़ें यहाँ से मैं कुछ भी कर सकता हूँ। बट जो हमारा मेन लॉजिक है जो चेंज नहीं होगा, वो ये है कि ये वाली की है, उसके अगेंस्ट ये डाटा है, राइट, तो वो एक इसलिए अलग से लेयर में बन गया, और फिर मुझे जहाँ भी ये चाहिए होगा, आई कैन जस्ट
हम्म।
कॉल दिस ऑब्जेक्ट schedule queries डॉट वीकली।
बेहतरीन, इसका कोई नेम है किसी, जिस तरह हम वो एटॉमिक स्ट्रक्चर डिजाइन होता है, एटॉमिक पैटर्न या बैम आर्किटेक्चर, कोई आर्किटेक्चर इसका कोई नाम है, मतलब जिस
या इसको
तरह।
क्यूरी फैक्ट्रीज को कहते हैं। इसमें एट द एंड एक्चुअली आई ऑल्सो वांटेड टू शेयर अ वेरी गुड रिसोर्स, एरर हैंडलिंग। तो इसमें ये एक पर्सन है टीके डोडो, वो अपना ब्लॉग लिखता है, और रिएक्ट क्यूरी में ना उसने ये 30 पोस्ट लिखे हैं, राइट।
ठीक है टू डूडू, अच्छा ठीक है मैं
हाँ,
सर्च कर लूँ। ठीक है डूडू।
तो ये आप देख लें, एनीवन कैन, लाइक, और
रिएक्ट
ये
क्यूरी।
जो सारी चीज़ें जो मैंने आपको बताई हैं, मोस्टली लाइक दे कम फ्रॉम रिएक्ट डॉक्स, राइट, द क्यू
यस।
रिएक्ट क्यूरी, एंड फ्रॉम दिस पर्सन ब्लॉग।
ये हम्म।
और ये पर्सन जो है इज एक्चुअली वन ऑफ द कंट्रीब्यूटर्स टू द रिएक्ट क्यूरी लाइब्रेरी, राइट। तो
ओके ओके
मतलब जो चीज़ें जो रिएक्ट क्यूरी बंदे बना रहे हैं, उनमें से एक बंदा ये है। और
ओके
फिर ये
ओके।
बताता है कि अच्छा यार, मतलब ये वाली इस तरह, probably you should use this probably like this, right।
राइट।
तो इसमें इसकी कोई होगी ये जो मैंने आपको बताया है ना, ये फैक्ट्री रेट क्यूरी चीज़, तो
एक्टिव रिएक्ट क्यूरी बस।
probably इसमें, हाँ, तो ये देख, इसमें वो कह रहा है कि यूज क्यूरी में हम्म, ये कोड कोड वाला लॉजिक के मेंटेनेबिलिटी थ्रू, ये ये वो कह रहा है कि storing all your query keys globally in a query keys file will make things better, right।
ओके
और वो
ओके
क्या
ओके।
करता है, मैं अपनी क्यूरीज के अगेंस्ट क्यूरी कीज रखता हूँ इंस्टेड ऑफ के मैं कोड में उसको मैन्युअली कर दूँ।
कोलोकेट, ठीक, कोलोकेट है, सही है।
और फिर ये
ठीक।
वो स्ट्रक्चर भी जो हमने अभी बनाया है, लाइक पहले एक मेन टू डूज, फिर उसकी लिस्ट, और फिर अगर टू डूज में से कोई डिटेल है,
हम्म।
ऑल ऑफ दिस थिंग्स।
ठीक है।
हाँ, ये की फैक्ट्रीज, दिस इज द कॉन्सेप्ट कि आपने उसकी फैक्ट्री बनाई हुई है इंस्टेड ऑफ, और फिर यहाँ पे आप ये चीज़ लाइक रीयूज भी कर सकते हैं। जिस तरह अब ये स्केजुअल क्यूरी डॉट रूट के है ना, नथिंग इज स्टॉपिंग मी फ्रॉम डिफाइनिंग स्केजुअल हेयर डायरेक्टली, राइट। अब इसमें ये थोड़ी सी फिर डुप्लीकेशन आ जाती है, बट एंड देन ऑल ऑफ दिस कम्स डाउन कि आप किस मतलब क्या स्ट्रक्चर फॉलो करना चाह रहे हैं, राइट।
हम्म।
तो अब इसमें थोड़ी सी रीडेबिलिटी कम हो गई है, राइट। इसमें आपको अजीब सा ही लगता है जो हम प्रोजेक्ट में यूज़ कर रहे हैं, वो ऑन फर्स्ट ग्लांस यू कांट अंडरस्टैंड कि ये है क्या क्या हो रहा है,
ऐसे ही है,
मतलब
ऐसे ही है, फर्स्ट
एग्जैक्टली।
ग्लांस में। हम्म।
तो दैट्स वाई आपको इसको हवर करके यहाँ से देखना पड़ता है कि अच्छा ये एक्चुअली में ये बनेगी, राइट। और फिर ये
राइट।
इस तरह आ रहा है, ये एज कॉन्स्ट ऐड करने की वजह से आ रहा है, तो दिस इज ऑल्सो हैक। तो टाइप स्क्रिप्ट में व्हेन वी मेक समथिंग एज कॉन्स्ट, अगर इसको हम एज कॉन्स्ट नहीं करते, राइट,
हम्म।
अगर हम डिलीट को एज कॉन्स्ट नहीं करते, तो अब डिलीट में क्या होगा, ये देखो वो कह रहा है कि ये डिलीट जो है ना एक स्ट्रिंग की लिस्ट हो सकती है, राइट। क्योंकि
राइट।
लिस्ट है ना, इसकी टाइप वगैरह स्ट्रिंग की लिस्ट हो सकती है। जब मैंने
ठीक
उसको
है।
एज कॉन्स्ट कर दिया है ना, तो
हम्म।
टाइप स्क्रिप्ट कहेगा अच्छा ये लिस्ट तो है, मगर इसमें जो भी डाटा पड़ा है ना, इसमें डाटा यही पड़ा है ना कि स्केजुअल है पहली की, और दूसरी की क्या है, डिलीट है, राइट। जब
राइट।
मैंने एज कॉन्स्ट किया, हो गया ये वाली जो लिस्ट है ये कभी भी अपडेट नहीं होगी, ये स्ट्रिंग की लिस्ट नहीं रही है, अब ये सिर्फ इन दो चीज़ों की लिस्ट है। इसलिए अब मैं जब इस पर हवर करता हूँ, तो अब मुझे ये बताता है कि ये रीड ओनली लिस्ट है सिर्फ इन दो चीज़ों की।
ओके, इसमें कोई
तो
स्ट्रिंग कुछ भी इसके अलावा नहीं आ सकती।
क्या, तो
एज कॉन्स्ट, ओके 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 ओके।
अब यहाँ से पर मुझे नहीं पता कि इसकी एक्चुअली की है क्या, तो आई जस्ट hover over it and then see okay schedule goals and active, so this is for fetching active goals.
ओके, और ये एज कॉन्स्ट, एज लेट, एज इसके इस करने की वजह से, और ना क्योंकि वो स्ट्रिंग में वो कुछ भी ले सकता है जिस तरह आपने ऊपर दिखाया है, लेकिन आपने स्पेसिफिक कर दिया कि इसमें ये क्यूरीज आ सकती हैं। होवर के ऊपर जो आपने
मतलब
दिखाई।
टाइप मैंने स्पेसिफाई कर दी ना उसकी, and this
ठीक है।
this also came from his blog or
ठीक
something,
है।
some-
एक इन्फिनिट इन्फिनिट क्यूरीज के अंदर हमने देखा था स्क्रॉल के ऊपर, हम उसको पेजिनेशन पे सेट कर सकते हैं, मतलब अगर मैं इन्फिनिट जो क्यूरीज थी वो हमने भी देखा था इन्फिनिट स्क्रॉल के ऊपर,
हम्म,
तो
अच्छा।
उसको हम पेजिनेशन में सेट कर सकते हैं, मतलब कि मतलब पेज चेंज हो तो तब भी हम यूज गेट क्यूरी की बजाय, जिसमें हम क्योंकि हमने डिपेंडेंसी पास की थी करंट पेज की पर पेज की,
हम्म,
तो मैं ये सोच रहा था कि ये हो सकता है क्योंकि हम पेजिनेशन में भी इन्फिनिट क्यूरी ही पास करें, जिसमें क्या करें जब वो पेज चेंज करे, जैसे स्क्रॉल करता था तो सिर्फ एपी कॉल होती थी।
हाँ हाँ ऑब्वियसली। अच्छा, इन्फिनिट क्यूरी में और सिंपल क्यूरी में क्या फ़र्क है? उसमें
अच्छा,
ये फ़र्क है,
इसमें गेट
इन्फिनिट
एक
क्यूरी
ना
में राइट।
हाँ। हाँ
तो
जी, इनिशियल इनिशियल उसमें नहीं होता, एरर दे देता है जिस तरह आपने बताया आज के, उसमें
हाँ,
कहता है कि भाई हम कहाँ यूज़ कर रहे हो, भाई यूज़ गेट क्यूरिंग जी।
तो अब ये वाली चीज़ें क्या है, ये बेसिकली पेज ही है ना, कि पहले मेरे पास हमने क्या किया था, यूज स्टेट बनाया था करंट पेज, राइट।
राइट, ऐसे ही है।
और फिर हमने उसको अपडेट किया था, राइट, गेट नेक्स्ट पेज।
जी, और क्यूरीज के अंदर उसकी वो नहीं दी थी तो चेंज नहीं हो रहा था, तो फिर
हाँ,
हमने क्या किया, ये राइट ऐसे ही है।
तो इन्फिनिट क्यूरी बेसिकली सिर्फ एक ये एक बड़ा कॉमन यूज केस था, इस वजह से उन्होंने इसकी अलग से क्यूरी बना दी, बट ऑल इट इज डूइंग इज इट इज मैनेजिंग द वो वाली जो स्टेट थी पेज वाली, वो अब ये इंटरनली मैनेज कर रही है, और इसने हमें
राइट।
फंक्शन दे दिया इज फैचिंग नेक्स्ट पेज, राइट।
सारी को जो हम स्टेट मैनेज ऊपर करते थे, कॉन्टेंट पेज सब कुछ आपने कहा था रिमूव कर देता है, ये सिर्फ यही मैनेज, इस फैचिंग नेक्स्ट पेज हैज नेक्स्ट, ये खुद ही मैनेज करता है, ऐसे ही है।
यस।
ठीक है
तो
ठीक है।
अब इसमें भी हम वो कर सकते हैं, इसको हम यूज क्यूरी को हम क्या कर सकते हैं, रिप्लेस कर सकते हैं विद दिस यूज इन्फिनिट क्यूरी। अभी इसमें गेट नेक्स्ट पेज ही करेगा, नेक्स्ट पेज,
एशियन
और
पेज
फिर
वन
ठीक है।
पर पेज।
तो अब हमारे ये पर पेज और इस करंट पेज की भी जरूरत नहीं है।
हाँ, नीचे भी आ रहा है पर पेज, हाँ।
अब
टास्क
हम
एट
क्या
इन्फिनिट।
करेंगे, अपने नेक्स्ट बटन पे हम क्या करेंगे, सिंपली वी विल जस्ट कॉल द गेट नेक्स्ट पेज। क्या
ओके
सुना?
ओके ओके, गेट
फैच
हैज
नेक्स्ट।
नेक्स्ट में
हाँ
फैच
fetch,
नेक्स्ट पेज।
right? और फिर इसी तरह इसमें obviously I didn't get the time to explain all of this, but
ओके ओके, मैं
फिर
अंडरस्टैंड
हम
कर
this
गया।
part भी क्या करते हैं, गेट नेक्स्ट
हम्म
पेज डॉट,
हम्म
तो फिर वो उसको हैज नेक्स्ट पेज को फॉल्स कर देता है, राइट? और इसी
राइट।
तरह गेट प्रीवियस पेज भी होता है,
गेट प्रीवियस, गेट प्रीवियस
right?
पेज।
ये भी एक
ओके।
ये होती है, ये भी गेट नेक्स्ट पेज की तरह ही है, बट अब इसमें हम क्या कर सकते हैं फिर, ये अब हमारा पेजिनेशन वाला पेज है, राइट? इसमें हैज
हम्म
नेक्स्ट पेज, हैज प्रीवियस पेज, और फिर यू गेस्ड इट, फेच प्रीवियस पेज, राइट?
राइट।
तो अब फिर हम अपने प्रीवियस वाले बटन पे क्या करेंगे, डॉट फेच प्रीवियस पेज। अब इसमें टाइप्स के कुछ इश्यूज आ रहे हैं विच वी कैन फिक्स, बट ठीक, अच्छा इसमें अब ये कह रहा है
पर पेज तो वो नहीं होगा ना।
कि ये जो कुछ तो ये इसको मसला है, बट लेट्स सी ये चलता है या नहीं चलता। टाइप्स के कुछ इश्यूज हैं, कुछ इशू, और लेट्स गो टू पेजिनेशन। करंट पेज इज नॉट डिफाइंड, अच्छा। तो फिर वो कह रहा है, नहीं, यहाँ पे उसने क्या किया था, क्यूरी फंक्शन को वो पेज पैरम देता था, राइट? और फिर हमने गेट इन्फिनिट कॉल किया था पेज पैरम के थ्रू। हमें यहाँ पे भी क्या करना है, टास्क क्यूरी डॉट, ऐसे हम कहते हैं डॉट गेट पेजिनेटेड पेज पैरम, then per page is not defined, so we just say two per page, right? Then use infinite query को क्या मसला है, has mode is missing, but
यूज प्रीफेच क्यूरी।
अच्छा फिर उसमें वो
क्यूरी की इसके अंदर हमने प्रीफेच जब किया है ना, वो दे रहा है।
ये वाले
ये
मसले हैं, यूज नहीं करते, लेकिन and
अच्छा,
then
यहाँ बस।
per page कहाँ से आ गया, पेजिनेशन पेज, राइट? अच्छा तो अब हमने वो पर पेज वाली भी स्टेट खत्म कर दिया, तो we just need to update this as well, comment this out। तो is placeholder data is not defined।
हाँ, उसमें हमने वो दिया था ना कि हैज की प्रीवियस डाटा। जी, इस प्लेस होल्डर डाटा जिस तरह आपने बताया था
हम्म
कि प्रीवियस डाटा।
अच्छा, और
कन्वर्टेड
फिर एक और जो चीज़ ये करता है इन्फिनिट क्यूरी, जो हमारे सिंपल पेजिनेटेड क्या होता है, वो तो हमारा एक जो भी बैकएंड से रिस्पॉन्स होता है वो आ जाता है ना।
हम्म
ये डाटा में हमें एक इस तरह का रिस्पॉन्स देता है, डाटा में ये पेजेस देता है कि जो भी पेजेस हैं,
हम्म
पेजेस के अगेंस्ट वो डाटा होता है, और फिर पेज पैरम्स जो भी होते हैं उसकी भी लिस्ट होती है किस्म की, राइट? पेजेस के अगेंस्ट ये पेजेस की लिस्ट होती है। तो हमें ना
ठीक है।
इसको फ्लैट करना पड़ता है, जिस तरह ये
हम्म।
यहाँ पे ये, जब हमारे इन्फिनिट एग्जांपल में जब एआई ने किया था उसने इसको फ्लैट मैप किया था, राइट?
राइट। फ्लैट
तो
मैप।
हमें अपनी इस वाली एग्जांपल में भी इसको फ्लैट मैप ही करना पड़ेगा, बल्कि इससे करवा लेते हैं ना। लेट्स अपडेट द पेजिनेशन पेज टू वर्क विद यूज इन्फिनिट। तो अब ये वाले हमारे ये मसले को भी सॉल्व कर देगा, बट व्हाट वी एक्चुअली नीड टू डू इज कि हम इस पे डाटा को उसने फिर वो उस इस वाले सिंटैक्स में रिटर्न कर दिया है, पेजेस वाले में, राइट? हमें उसको फ्लैट करने की ज़रूरत है।
जी।
ठीक है, जस्ट ट्राइंग टू अपडेट द डिड एवरीथिंग। अच्छा, अब ये सब यूआई वगैरह अपडेट कर रहा है, हम बस क्यूरी वाली चेंजेस देखेंगे वो इसने क्या की है। लेट्स सी। अब भी इसका लॉजिक नहीं सही, नेक्स्ट और तो आई थिंक फिनिश्ड। अब देखें, अब ये नेक्स्ट पेज फैच हो गया उस पर।
यस, यही चीज।
ने यूज क्यूरी से ही कर दिया ना
क्यूरी से।
स्टेट। हाँ।
हाँ, उसी
अब
के यूज इन्फिनिट क्यूरी से।
क्यूरी फंक्शन, अब बेसिकली क्या हो रहा है, नेक्स्ट पेज वाली जो स्टेट थी वो इधर क्यूरी के अंदर मैनेज हो रही है, हमारे पास वो नहीं है कि इसने करंट पेज वैसे रखा है। बट ये मेनली स्टेट यहाँ पे अपडेट हो रही है, और अब ये नेक्स्ट और प्रीवियस में ये क्या कर रहा होगा बटन्स में, ये वो हैंडल नेक्स्ट कॉल कर रहा है, और हैंडल नेक्स्ट में वो सिर्फ
जस्ट करंट पेज की स्टेट बनाइए,
नेक्स्ट
बाकी उसी में जी।
फेच नेक्स्ट।
हैज नेक्स्ट। ठीक है।
बट अब ये इसने फिर डिफेंसिव कुछ चीज़ें कर दी हैं कि पहले वो देखे अगर नेक्स्ट पेज है भी तो नहीं, फिर भी कॉल करो, राइट।
बेसिकली हैज नेक्स्ट पेज उसी में से ही हम निकालेंगे,
नंबर भी
स्ट्रक्चर करेंगे।
फॉर सम रीज़न ये रख रहा है। Can you simplify this? But like we can do this, थोड़ा सा सोच के
ओके,
कर।
ओके, ओके। बेसिकली हमने अगर सेट करंट पेज और करंट पेज की स्टेट इनिशियल नहीं देनी पड़ेगी उसको, क्योंकि उसे ये तो बताना पड़ेगा क्या फर्क, कहाँ से स्टार्ट करना है, फर्स्ट पेज पे, या जिस तरह हम उसमें बता देते हैं कि 2 रिकॉर्ड्स आने हैं या 5 रिकॉर्ड्स आने चाहिए। तो बस
हम्म,
ये कंफर्म मैं करना चाह रहा हूँ कि जो अभी आपने कहा था, जब हमने अभी देखा था कि इन्फिनिट क्यूरी में सारा कुछ डिस्ट्रक्चर करते थे हम, हैज नेक्स्ट पेज, इज फैचिंग, इज प्रीवियस पेज, सर आपने बताया। ठीक
हम्म,
है। तो हम ये कर सकते हैं। तो इससे जो मैनुअल हम करते थे पर पेज की और ये करंट पेज की सारी जो कॉम्प्लेक्स स्टेट्स है ना, उसने रिमूव की थी, जब आपने ये से पूछा था तब उसने रिमूव की थी। इसका मतलब वो मैनुअल स्टेट मैंने खत्म हो जाती है, ये खुद ही हैंडल करती है चीजें। इस तरह हैज
हम्म।
नेक्स्ट पेज, हैज प्रीवियस पेज। ठीक है, ठीक।
हाँ वही ना,
बेहतरीन।
इन्फिनिट क्यूरी में उन्होंने चीज़ ये इम्प्लीमेंट किया ना कि आप उसको एक इनिशियल पेज बताओगे, एक नेक्स्ट पेज बताओगे, ठीक है।
हम्म,
तो वो क्या करेगा, जब आप ये कॉल फैच नेक्स्ट पेज कॉल करेगा ना, तो वो यहाँ से इस फंक्शन को एग्जीक्यूट करके अगला पेज लेगा और उसको थ्रू क्यूरी फंक्शन कॉल कर देगा, राइट।
बेहतरीन, बेहतरीन, राइट।
हाँ। बट
ठीक।
यहाँ पे वो पेज वाला लॉजिक ना थोड़ा सा कॉम्प्लेक्स हो जाएगा, क्योंकि
हम्म,
पहले तो जो सिंपल यूज के में हमारे पास इसी पेज का डाटा होता था, राइट, जब हम पेज करते थे उसी पेज का डाटा होता था।
हम्म।
अब ये इन्फिनिट क्यूरी क्या करती है, ये सारा डाटा ना कंबाइन करती है। और
हाँ, हाँ, हाँ।
आइडियली वी शुड यूज इट कि जब एक हमारे पास एक इस तरह की स्टेट है, राइट, एक हमारे पास कंडीशन है कि हम ना अपना पेज पूरे को डाटा को ना रिप्लेस करना चाहते हैं, उसके लिए हमें क्या करना चाहिए, यूज क्यूरी प्लस आवर ऑन पेजिनेशन स्टेट। वो बहुत सिंपल है, बहुत सिंपल है, राइट।
राइट।
और एक है कि अब मैं अपने पेज के डाटा को रिप्लेस नहीं करना चाहता, रिप्लेस, डोंट रिप्लेस, बट अपेंड करना चाहता हूँ, जो भी अगले पेज से जो भी डाटा आया है मैं पिछले डाटा में अपेंड करना चाहता हूँ, राइट, कंबाइन करना चाहता हूँ,
जी।
कंबाइन। तो उस यूज केस के लिए दिस इन्फिनिट क्यूरी इज मोर यूजफुल, राइट।
ओके।
अदरवाइज अगर इस यूज केस के लिए हम करने की कोशिश करेंगे ना, तो फिर यहाँ पे जो ये वाला जो डेटा है करंट पेज वाला,
हम्म।
तो ये फिर इसको मैन्युअली वो सारे पेजेस में से जाके फिर वो करंट पेज फैच करना पड़ा है, राइट।
ठीक है, ठीक, ठीक है,
और
जो कि
ये
हम उधर मैनुअल स्टेट से कर रहे होते थे, जो कि
हाँ,
हमें।
ये बहुत सिंपल था।
हाँ, जिसमें क्यूरी क्यूरी फंक्शन को पता लग जाता था कि करंट पेज डिपेंडेंसी वो चेंज हो रहा है, उतना डाटा उसको शो करना है। जबकि ये सारा डाटा इकट्ठा ले जाती है, उसको पेंड करने के लिए फिर इसमें यूज कर सकते हैं। ठीक है।
और ये मेरे ख्याल से इसका लॉजिक है भी गलत,
हम्म।
और ये प्रीवियस वाला कभी करने ही नहीं दे रहा, मैं प्रीवियस पेज पे जाने ही नहीं दे रहा।
ठीक है। और वो
बट
अगर बैकएंड से हमें मेटा के अंदर मिल रही हैं चीज़ें, तो हम टेंस स्टैक में उसमें फिर यूज कर सकते हैं ना। फॉर
हाँ,
एग्जांपल, मेटा
हाँ,
के अंदर पेज लिमिट, पेज साइज मिल रहा होता है, तो हम बेसिकली उनकी बैकएंड की पेजिनेशन लगा के इसके टेंस स्टैक के साथ कंबाइन कर सकते हैं ना।
यस,
ठीक है, ठीक है।
बट
ओके
अगेन ट्राई टू कीप थिंग्स सिंपल, जो चीज़ सिंपल तरीके से हो रही होती है उसको
वैसे।
ये नहीं करना।
ठीक, ठीक है सर। जज़ाकल्लाह।
ठीक है, इसके अलावा कोई क्वेश्चन है?
इसके अलावा इसमें बेनिफिट्स, ये जो डॉक्यूमेंट आप शेयर कर देंगे ये डिस्कॉर्ड पे, या कहीं चैट में शेयर कर दें वैसे, या डिस्कॉर्ड पे, ये जो आपके पास डॉक्यूमेंट है?
मैं कुछ आपको कहाँ शेयर करूँ, कैसे शेयर?
ये चैट चैट में अगर कोई है तो। ईस्ट बिन।
ठीक है, आई थिंक और कोई क्वेश्चन है तो यू गाइस कैन आस्क, आपके अलावा भी शायद एक दो लोग हैं।
जी।
अकीब एंड जैन, इफ अगर आप लोगों को क्वेश्चन है तो आप भी पूछ सकते हैं। और
हाँ
एक चीज़
सर,
है,
मेरा
मैं कहना
क्वेश्चन है।
चाहूँगा कि यार ये वाले जो हमने यूज़ कैसे किए हैं ना, ऑब्वियसली लाइक यू विल यूज दीज थिंग्स जब आपको उसकी ज़रूरत पड़ेगी, जब किसी जगह पे आपको इन्फिनिट स्क्रोल इम्प्लीमेंट करना होगा, फिर ही आप ये वाली चीज़ें करोगे, राइट? और एट दैट
राइट।
टाइम डॉक्यूमेंटेशन देख सकते हो आप, यू कैन फिगर आउट अ बेटर वे टू लाइक इम्प्लीमेंट दिस। जिस तरह यहाँ पे ये टाइम मास्टर वाले में मैंने वो की हुई थी, कैंसिल क्यूरीज की हुई थी, राइट? कैंसिल
राइट।
की बगैर ऑप्टिमिस्टिक अपडेट
हम्म।
एक बगी, बट वो फिर मैंने बताई नहीं है अभी, क्योंकि हमारे पास ऑब्वियसली टाइम कम था, तो हमने वो प्रोडक्शन लेवल की चीज़ें नहीं की। बट
हम्म।
यू गाइस हैव एन ओवरव्यू ऑफ कि चीज़ें अच्छा काम किस तरह करती हैं, क्या क्या ऑप्शन हैं, एंड देन ऑब्वियसली व्हेन यू आर इम्प्लीमेंटिंग इट ऑन प्रोडक्शन, तो आप फिर उसको रिफाइन कर सकते हैं अपने हिसाब से चीज़ों।
जी सर। जज़ाकल्लाह।
यार मेरे साथ एक मसला है कि सेशन लंबे बहुत हो जाते हैं।
वैसे ये आहद भाई, और 1 घंटे से ज्यादा, 1 घंटा होता है उधर से। जियान भाई कहते हैं ठीक है, कहते हैं छोड़ो बस, अगले अगले में। जी
चलें,
सर
कोई
हम।
नहीं।
अ, उसामा भाई भी 1 घंटे से ज्यादा, 1 घंटा। सारे आहद भाई, उसामा भाई, जिशान भाई, वो भाई 1 घंटे से ज्यादा नहीं देते। ठीक।
अहमद भाई, मैं ये पूछ रहा था आपसे। ना, मुझे कोडिंग नहीं आती। लाइक आप ये वेब डेवलपमेंट हो गया, एआई का मुझे थोड़ा बहुत आइडिया है। मैंने उसकी ट्रेनिंग ली थी 2 ढाई मंथ की। तो मैं इसको कैसे लेके चलूँ? मैंने तो लीड कोड भी इतना नहीं किया हुआ, कोई 15 एक सवाल कोई किए हुए हैं, तो अभी कर रहा हूँ। तो मैं इसको कैसे लेके चलूँ? मेरे लिए तो ये काफी चीजें मुश्किल होती हैं क्लास में बैठ के समझना।
यार आपको मेंटोर साइन होगा?
हाँ जी, वो शेर भाई हैं।
हम्म। तो आइडियली आप क्या कर रहे होंगे, आप अभी उनसे अपने नेक्स्ट टास्क ले रहे होंगे, ठीक है?
हाँ, उन्होंने मुझे एक दिया था फ्रंट एंड का। अब वो
हम्म।
मैंने आज ही कंप्लीट किया है, वो श्रद्धा दीदी वाला।
हम्म।
HTML का था बेसिक।
हम्म।
वो अभी अभी नेक्स्ट तो उन्होंने नहीं दिया। तो
हाँ,
इसका क्या है, यानी कि इसको मैं फास्ट कैसे लेके चलूं?
इसको इसको अभी इसकी आपको समझ नहीं आएगी, और अभी आपको इसको करने की कोशिश भी नहीं करनी चाहिए। जब आपने
हाँ।
HTML कर लेनी है, जब आपने CSS कर लेनी है, जब आपने जावास्क्रिप्ट कर लेनी है, फिर उसके बाद आपने रिएक्ट कर लेनी है, फिर उसके बाद आपने इन चीज़ों के बारे में सोचना है। लाइक अभी इट्स नाइस कि आपने सेशन लिया है, सेशन लेने में कोई हर्ज नहीं है, राइट? बट डोंट एक्सपेक्ट ऑफ योर सेल्फ कि अच्छा यार मुझे समझ क्यों नहीं आ रही चीज़ें, क्योंकि अभी आपको आइडिया ही नहीं है ना, आपको समझ आनी भी नहीं है बाय डिज़ाइन।
हम्म।
तो इफ यू वांट के जस्ट आप सेशंस ले लें, कोई उसमें मसला नहीं है। बट आइडियली अभी आप अपनी पेस पे चीज़ों को लेके चल रहे होंगे, जो आपके नेक्स्ट गोल्स हैं, right? जो नेक्स्ट माइलस्टोन है, वो आप सीख रहे होंगे, उन चीज़ों पे आप ज़्यादा फोकस कर रहे होंगे। और फिर जब इनका टाइम आएगा, जब आप ये एच टी एम एल सी एस एस जावास्क्रिप्ट रिएक्ट कर लेंगे, ठीक है, फिर आप फिर आप रिएक्ट क्यूरी पे भी आ जाएंगे, तो उसमें मसला नहीं है।
हम्म, ठीक हो गया भाई।
जी।
भाई बस एक
थैंक यू।
क्वेश्चन था। एक क्वेश्चन बस थे, एक लास्ट था।
हम्म
वो ये था कि अभी स्लाइस के आपने एक बात की थी कि हम इस तरह करते थे स्लाइस में, जब हम फॉर एग्जांपल ये जब रिडक्स टूलकिट में काम करते थे ना, तो हम कंपोनेंट्स एपी कॉल करते थे, जिसमें हमने यूज इफेक्ट या जिसमें रख के एपी कॉल करते, वो स्लाइस के पास जाता था जहाँ पे एसिंग थंग की लॉजिक होती थी। उधर से हम जाते थे सर्विस के अंदर, फिर सर्विस से बैक वो स्लाइस एसिंग थंग के पास आता था, वो स्टोर में हमने रिड्यूसर बनाए होते थे। तो
हम्म
उसमें हम जब डिलीट करते थे ना, तो हमें ना गेट की ईपी मैन्युअली दोबारा कॉल करनी पड़ती थी डिलीट के बाद।
हम्म
तो और ऐसे ही होता था हर डिलीट की ईपी। अब तो इसमें क्यूरीज हैं, इनवैलिडेट टैग्स हैं, इनवैलिडेट क्यूरीज हैं। तो उसका कोई और हल है कि अगर हमने डिलीट के बाद गेट की ईपी कॉल नहीं करनी, या अपडेट के बाद गेट की ईपी कॉल नहीं करनी, तो हम इसको कैसे वर्ड कर सकते हैं कि अगर वो कहता है कि यार ये तो डबल डबल ईपी कॉल अब डिलीट करना है, अब तो हम डिलीट के लिए इनवैलिडेट टैग्स या क्यूरीज यूज कर लेते हैं। तो
हम्म
इसका इसका एक आंसर आप बताते हैं कोई, कि इसका हल इसके अलावा क्या है कि डिलीट की ईपी अपडेटेड डाटा भी आ जाए? तो क्योंकि
हम्म
हम तो डबल एपीआई कॉल करते थे गेट का रिफ्रेश डाटा लाने के लिए, जैसे कि हमने अभी आज सारा देखा कि कैसे हम आपने हमें क्यूरीज का बताया, क्यूरी फंक्शंस जो हैं वो बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट होते हैं, सेम जब उसको इनवैलिडेट होता है। तो
हम्म।
इसका क्या सोल्यूशन होगा कि इसके अलावा कोई, क्योंकि फिर वो तो अप्रोच वो रिडक्स टूलकिट वाली बहुत पुरानी हो जाएगी।
हाँ, इसलिए तो दैट वाज द होल आइडिया ऑफ दिस सेशन, के यार आपने सर्वर साइड और इस वो वाली जो क्लाइंट साइड स्टेट है वो बहुत डिफरेंट है, राइट?
जी,
तो
राइट
आप
राइट।
यू शुड बी
हम्म।
ट्राइंग टू मर्ज देम टुगेदर।
ओके ओके, मर्ज करने
तो
टुगेदर,
आइडियली
ठीक।
आप वो नहीं करना चाहेंगे, आपको वो नहीं करना चाहिए। बट अगर आपने करना है तो फिर उसका तरीका वो होगा कि आप अपने डिलीट के जो एंड पॉइंट है उसकी नेटवर्क रिक्वेस्ट से आप अपडेटेड जो भी रिस्पॉन्स, बल्कि डिलीट तो हो गया है, तो
हम्म।
अगर अपडेट की है तो फिर जो भी अपडेटेड ऑब्जेक्ट है वो रिटर्न करेंगे। और फिर आप अपने स्लाइस में मैन्युअली उसको सेट करेंगे एसिंग थंक में, से वो रिटर्न करेंगे। और फिर जो थंक के बाद एक हैंडलर फंक्शन होता है, राइट,
राइट।
उसमें फिर आप मैन्युअली जिस तरह हमने ऑप्टिमिस्टिक में मैन्युअली सेट किया है, उसमें आपको
हम्म।
कैश करना पड़ेगा अगर आपने एक और नेटवर्क रिक्वेस्ट नहीं करनी तो।
ठीक है।
मैन्युअली करनी
वो
पड़ेगा।
स्लाइस थंग के अंदर वो, क्योंकि मैंने देखा है अक्सर लोगों का थंग बहुत भरा रहता है, उसमें बिजनेस लॉजिक बहुत लिखी होती है। तो इसका मतलब वो इसी कॉल से बचने के लिए फिर हमें वो बिजनेस लॉजिक उस थंग के अंदर देनी पड़ेगी, कि हम अपडेटेड डाटा जो है ना, फिर एपी कॉल बचाने के लिए उसी में लिखनी पड़ेगी कि फिल्टर आउट करेंगे रिस्पॉन्स, जिस तरह आपने भी बताया कि प्रीवियस चेक करेगा, उसके बाद चेक करेगा डिलीट के बाद अपडेटेड रिस्पॉन्स क्या आता है, फिर रिटर्न करवाए।
या
ठीक है, बेहतरीन सर, बेहतरीन। जज़ाकल्लाह।
ओके, एनी अदर क्वेश्चंस?
नो सर, फिलहाल नहीं। नॉट माई
ठीक,
साइड।
मतलब सेशन ठीक था टाइम के अलावा।
बेहतरीन सर, मैंने तो टेंस स्टैक में बहुत सारी देखी हैं, वो जो आपने बताया था जो क्रिएटर है टेंस स्टैक का, वो बहुत देखी है। लेकिन ये जो आपने बताई है ना चीज़ें, ये तो लगता है मुझे कितने साल के दो साल तीन आपके कितने एक्सपीरियंस किए आपने चीज़ें बताई हैं।
हम्म।
लेक्चर्स में तो सिर्फ वो आप रड बना के दिखा देते हैं
वही
और
ना।
बस खत्म। खत्म कहानी, कोई पोलिंग कोलिंग का सीन ही नहीं है, किसी भी आर्ट की क्यूरी समझने बैठो बस छोटी मोटी रड बना के साइड पे। तो ये तो आपने एक्सपीरियंस अपना शेयर किया, अल्लाह ताला जज़ा दे आपको।
हाँ,
यही
दैट
सीन
वाज
है।
थॉट, इसके पीछे वो भी यही थी
ठीक है
कि
विजात
जो
भाई, मैं ना, जी जी।
जो जो पैटर्न अभी मैंने इम्प्लीमेंट किए हुए हैं ना प्रोडक्शन में,
जी
वही
जी।
थोड़ा सा अंदर डिस्कस करें।
जी, मैं ना ये लिंक फिर भी डॉक्स वाला ना, ब्रेव मेरा जो आई थिंक सो सामा भाई हैं मेंटोर, तो मैं अपने ग्रुप में डाल दूंगा ये डॉक्स का लिंक, ताकि किसी और के भी काम आ जाए ना, जो आपने शेयर किया।
ठीक है, वैसे ये इतना अच्छा नहीं है बट अब कर लें,
चलें फिर आप शेयर कर दें।
प्रूव
हाँ,
करके।
ठीक है। ठीक
हाँ,
है।
क्योंकि
ठीक है
उसमें तो
सर जी।
कुछ चीज़ें असल चीज़ें सेशन में थी। वो तो मैंने ऐसे बस वो एज अ गाइडलाइन बनाया था कि ये चीज़ें डिस्कस करनी।
ठीक है। ओके, थैंक यू।
ओके, थैंक यू अहमद, थैंक यू एवरीवन एल्स, बाय बाय।
थैंक यू सर, बाय बाय। थैंक यू फॉर योर टाइम।